Hello friends, about the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed. And I would be really happy if you do so. Also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped off the snowmobile, its engine idling in the frozen silence. The driver, a grizzled man named Vic, nodded toward the fire tower looming in the distance. "You'll be fine," he muttered, his voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around his face. "Just remember the rules. Frank's always on the radio if you need him." I nodded back, though my chest tightened with apprehension. This wasn't just a job for me, it was an escape. The cold, desolate Alaskan wilderness was the perfect place to disappear for a while, to put distance between me and the life I'd left behind. The kind of distance that felt safe, necessary. The fire tower stood alone in the clearing, an 80-foot sentinel against the sea of pines that stretched endlessly in all directions. It looked older than I expected, its wooden frame weathered and creaking in the stiff wind. A set of rickety stairs spiraled to the top, where a small cabin perched like a bird's nest. I swallowed hard, adjusted my backpack, and trudged toward it. Vic called after me, his voice sharp despite the wind. "One last thing, don't mess with the flood light unless you have to." I frowned, turning back. "Why?" He shrugged, as if it wasn't worth explaining. "You'll know if you need it." Then he revved the engine and sped off, leaving a plume of snow in his wake. I was alone inside the tower. The air was stale and faintly metallic, a smell that clung to the walls like the residue of a long-forgotten fire. The cabin was small but functional, a bunk with a thin mattress, a wood stove, a desk cluttered with outdated maps, and a single radio that sat atop a stack of manuals. The radio crackled to life as I dropped my gear. "Is this the new guy?" The voice was rough but warm, like gravel wrapped in a blanket. I pressed a button on the side of the handset. "Yeah, just got here. You must be Frank." "That's right. Welcome to paradise," he said with a dry chuckle. "First things first, settle in, but read the manual, follow the rules, and you'll be fine." "Anything specific I should know?" There was a pause, static hissing faintly in the background. "A few things. Don't leave the tower after dark, no matter what you hear. Don't shine the floodlight unless it's an emergency, and if the radio goes dead, stay put until morning." His tone made it clear he wasn't joking. I nodded to myself. "Got it." The line went quiet and I placed the handset back on its cradle. My eyes wandered to the desk where a thick, dog-eared manual sat beneath a stack of papers. On top of the pile was a leather-bound journal. Curious, I flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was scrolled and uneven, as if the writer had been in a rush or under duress. March 3rd, first day at the tower. Quiet, so far too quiet. The forest stretches on forever, a sea of black pines against the snow. It feels alive, somehow, like it's watching me. I'm probably just tired or imagining things. The entry ended abruptly and I flipped forward, skimming through pages filled with fragmented thoughts. As I read, a pattern emerged. The writer, someone named Eddie, had worked in the tower years ago. His early entries were mundane observations about the weather and the monotony of the job, but as I reached the later pages, his tone changed. March 12th, the wind doesn't sound right. It's not just wind, it's voices. I tried the floodlight, but it didn't help, just made things worse. I snapped the journal shut, a shiver crawling up my spine. My gaze drifted to the window where the snow swirled in the fading light. The forest was dark now, its shadows stretching like fingers toward the base of the tower. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease that had crept in. It was just a Story: a man stuck in isolation, letting his mind get the better of him, wasn't it? That night the wind howled around the tower, shaking the walls and groaning through the beams. I lay on the bunk staring at the ceiling, the journal's words circling in my mind. Somewhere outside, a faint knocking sound broke through the noise. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random creaks of the structure settling in the cold. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk and approached the window, my heart hammering. The forest was still blanketed in snow, but the sound continued. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the supports beneath the tower, just the wind. I whispered to myself, though the words rang hollow. I wanted to believe, and I needed to believe it. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, straining to hear anything else, but the only sound was the faint hiss of the wind. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I forced myself to shake off the unease and focus on the job. Through the binoculars I scanned the horizon, looking for smoke or any signs of trouble. The landscape was pristine, a frozen expanse of white and green that seemed endless. By noon the radio crackled again. "How's it going up there?" Frank's voice broke the silence. "Quiet," I replied. "No smoke, no issues. That's good. Keep your eyes open. This time of year things can change fast." Before I could respond, the radio emitted a strange burst of static, followed by a faint voice, too faint to make out the words. I adjusted the dial, but the line went dead. "Frank," I said into the handset. No response, just static. I set it down, frowning. Maybe the storm the night before had messed with the signal, or maybe it was just old equipment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the journal on the desk, its leather cover almost daring me to open it again, but I resisted. Instead, I picked up the binoculars and resumed my watch. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was distant, little more than a shadow among the trees, but it was unmistakably human. My pulse quickened as I adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer view. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching, and then as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I lowered the binoculars, my hands trembling, my mind raced with questions. Who or what was that, and why had they been standing there so close to the tower? I didn't have answers, but as the daylight faded and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night the knocking returned, louder this time and more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the same spot beneath the tower, but now it was joined by something else, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging against wood. I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white, and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty forest below, but the sounds didn't stop. Knock, knock, scrape. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. The radio was dead again, and the floodlight fix warning echoed in my mind. Don't mess with the floodlight unless you have to. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the switch. Was this an emergency? Did I need it? The knocking grew louder, more frantic. With a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The floodlight roared to life, bathing the clearing in a harsh white glow. For a moment the forest seemed to recoil, its shadows retreating like living things, and then I saw it standing just beyond the edge of the light. Was the figure from before. It was closer now, its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. It didn't move, it just stared. The floodlight flickered and my blood ran cold when it steadied. The figure was gone. I turned off the light and locked the door, my hands trembling. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait for dawn and hope I'd make it through the night. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I sat slumped in the chair by the desk, exhausted but alive. The journal stared back at me, its leather cover gleaming faintly in the pale light. I opened it again, flipping to a page I hadn't read before. The words seemed to leap off the page, scrawled in frantic even strokes. If you see it, don't look away. If it knocks, don't answer. It wants you to break the rules. I closed the journal with a snap, my heart pounding. Whatever I'd signed up for, it was far more than just a job, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The snow around the fire tower sparkled under the weak morning sun, a deceptively calm scene that felt worlds away from the night's events. My body ached from the tension of staying awake, and my mind raced fade with unanswered questions. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen, the way it stood at the edge of the light, unmoving yet undeniably aware of me. I busied myself with routine tasks to push the memory aside. I scanned the forest with the binoculars, panning slowly across the endless sea of pines. Nothing unusual, no smoke, no movement, but the eerie stillness felt like a warning. The radio crackled suddenly and I jumped. Morning, Frank's voice greeted me, calm and familiar. Morning, I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. Everything's quiet, no smoke. That's good, Frank said. Then he hesitated. How was last night? I paused, debating whether to tell him the knocking, the scraping, the figure, but I remembered his earlier instructions: follow the rules and don't ask too many questions. It was fine, I lied. Frank didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped. Good, keep your head on straight out there. This job has a way of messing with people. The line went dead before I could reply. By mid-afternoon, a faint column of smoke appeared on my horizon, a dark thread against the pale blue sky. My heart sank. It wasn't supposed to happen this early in the season. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. Frank, do you copy? There's smoke southeast of my position, maybe 5 miles out. Static hiss followed by a faint fragmented sound that didn't resemble Frank's voice. I adjusted the dial, but the line stayed dead. Frank, are you there? Nothing. I stared at the smoke, unsure of what to do. The manual was clear about staying close to the tower, but the situation didn't feel like something I could ignore. If there was a fire, it could spread quickly, and I couldn't count on Frank to help. Grabbing my backpack, I stuffed it with essentials: water, a flashlight, a flare gun. I slipped the journal into a side pocket almost as an afterthought. The thick leather made me feel slightly more grounded, as absurd as that seemed. Finally, I grabbed a rifle mounted on the wall. It was old and heavy, but the ammunition was intact. I didn't know what I was expecting to encounter, but after last night I wasn't taking any chances. I descended the tower, the stairs creaking under my boots, and set off toward the smoke. The forest was silent as I moved through it, the snow crunching softly beneath my feet. The air was sharp and cold, biting in my face and filling my lungs with every breath. As I walked, the smoke grew closer, thicker, until the acrid smell of burning would reach my nose. I found the source about an hour later, a campsite, or rather what was left of one. The fire had been small and contained, but it had burned down to ashes. Around it there were signs of a hasty departure: an overturned kettle, a torn sleeping bag, a scattering of belongings half buried in the snow. I crouched down, inspecting the scene. Something felt off. There were no Footprints leading away from the site, no signs of anyone leaving, just the eerie suggestion that whoever had been here had vanished into thin air. Among the scattered items, something caught my eye. A blood-stained map. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as though it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. An X was scrawled on it in red ink, marking a spot deeper in the forest. My fingers hesitated before picking it up. The sight of the blood made my stomach churn, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I folded the map carefully and slid it into my pocket. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying a faint hollow sound that I couldn't quite place. A chill ran down my spine. I stood scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the endless pines swaying gently in the breeze. I decided to head back to the tower. Whatever I'd stumbled upon, it wasn't something I wanted to deal with out here. The feeling of being watched clung to me all the way back. Night fell quickly, as it always did in the wilderness, and I returned to the relative safety of the tower. I locked the hatch behind me and double-checked the floodlight switches, making sure everything was in order. The rifle was propped against the wall beside the desk within easy reach. As I sat down, the journal called to me, its leather cover glinting faintly in the lamplight. I flipped to a random page, my heart heavy with apprehension. March 15th. I saw it again, just standing there watching. I think it wants me to leave, but it doesn't seem angry. Not yet. If I break the rules, though, I don't think it will let me go. The words sent a shiver through me. Was Eddie writing about the same figure I'd seen, the same one that had been just beyond the floodlight's reach? A loud knock jolted me from my thoughts. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder than before, echoing through the straw with a deliberate rhythm. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the flashlight. This time the sound wasn't coming from beneath the tower. It was coming from the stairs. I stood, every muscle in my body tensed, and moved toward the window. The flashlight's beam swept over the steps, illuminating nothing but the empty wood. The knocking stopped abruptly. Then faintly I heard it, a low scraping sound like nails dragging along the outer wall of the cabin. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned toward the floodlight switch, but a sudden surge of static from the radio made me freeze. The noise was sharp, grating, and it quickly gave way to something worse, a voice. It wasn't Frank's voice. It was distorted, guttural, and wrong. You're now alone. The words were faint but unmistakable. My hand hovered over the radio, unsure whether to respond. The static returned louder now until the speaker emitted a sharp crack and went silent. I stared at the radio, my mind racing. The knock, the scrape, the voice, it was all connected somehow, but I didn't know how to make sense of it. A sudden thud against the wall snapped me out of my thoughts. This wasn't random. It was testing me, trying to make me break the rules. I had to hold firm. I turned off the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting pale beams through the windows. I sat in the corner, clutching the rifle, and waited. The knocking didn't come again that night, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. The next morning I unfolded the blood-stained map on the desk. The X stared back at me as if daring me to find it. I didn't know why. Eddie's journal hadn't mentioned a map or a camera site, but the connection felt undeniable. I grabbed the journal again, flipping through the pages in search of answers. One line stood out, written in shaky handwriting near the end. March 18th. It's drawing me closer. I think it wants me to find something, or maybe it's leading me to my end. My hand trembled as I set the Journal down the X loomed large in my mind, a mystery I couldn't ignore, but the rule tools were clear: stay in the tower after dark, and yet part of me wondered if that was exactly what it wanted. The journal's leather cover felt heavier in my hands as I opened it again. The faint smell of aged paper mingling with the cold air in the cab, and my eyes scanned the jagged handwriting of Eddie, the previous firewater. It was the only thing tethering me to some semblance of understanding, or at least I hoped it would. Be March 20th. I know it's watching me. Every time I turn away I can feel it. They're waiting. It doesn't just want me gone, it wants me to see something, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to look. The words sank in, gnawing at my thoughts. Eddie had walked these same steps, climbed these stairs, and stared out into the same forest, and yet he hadn't made it out. What was it that he couldn't face? I flipped ahead. The pages filled up with hurried, fragmented entries. Each one was more erratic than the last. March 22nd. It's not the forest that's alive, it's the space between the trees. It moves when I blink, when I sleep, when I think I'm safe. March 23rd. The knocking isn't random, it's a language I tried to knock back. And now it's louder, closer. Don't answer, don't respond, don't look. I shut the journal abruptly, my pulse quickening. A deep unease settled over me, like the weight of the air had shifted outside. The snow fell softly, coating the forest in a deceptive stillness, but Eddie's words lingered, sharp and insistent. It's a language. The day passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound outside the tower felt amplified: the groan of the wind, the creak of the wood, the distant snap of a branch. I busied self scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, but the binoculars revealed only an endless expanse of white and green. By late afternoon the radio crackled to life. Frank, I grabbed the handset, my voice shaky with relief. His tone was clipped. You've been quiet. I saw smoke yesterday, I said, hesitating, and I found something: a campsite, but no footprints. And this? I unfolded the blood-stained map as if he could see it through the static. There's a marked spot deeper in the forest. Frank was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Don't go near it. Why not? I demanded. What is it? You're there to watch, not to wander. Stay in the tower, keep your eyes open, and follow the rules. That's how you make it through. The line went dead before I could argue. My friend, frustration boiled over, and I slammed the handset onto the desk. Frank's cryptic warnings weren't enough anymore. I needed answers. That night the knocking returned. It started faintly, a soft rhythm on the stairs. Knock, knock, knock. Each impact reverberated through the wooden frame of the tower, deliberate and insistent. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight. The beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The sound grew louder, more forceful. Knock, knock, knock. This time it wasn't just on the stairs, it was on the walls, the windows, the very structure of the cabin. It was everywhere surrounding me. I backed into the corner, gripping a rifle tightly, and shouted into the empty air, what do you want? The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. I strained to hear anything, any movement, any whisper, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing. And then faintly a new sound emerged, a low guttural hum, like a chant carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the radio. I stared at the handset, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. Static buzzed, faintly interspersed with unintelligible words. A voice, not Frank, Frank slipped closer. The distorted voice whispered. I dropped the handset, the sound continuing even as it hit the floor. My eyes darted to the map on the desk, the red X glaring back at me like a challenge. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't sit here and let this thing, whatever it was, toy with me. If the map was a clue, I needed to follow it. Eddie's journal might have been his warning, but it was also my guide, and right now it was the only thing making any sense. I packed quickly, taking the rifle, the flashlight, and the map. The journal came with me too, its weight a small comfort. Before I left, I turned on the floodlight, its powerful beam cutting through the morning fog, a beacon in case I needed to find my way back. The forest was colder than usual, the air biting at my face as I trudged through the snow. The map led me southeast, deeper into the trees. The further I went, the quieter it became, the snow muffling my footsteps and the wind barely rustling the branches above. After an hour, I noticed something strange. The trees around me bore markings, deep gouges carved into the bark, forming crude, jagged shapes. They didn't look like natural damage, they looked deliberate, like someone or something had left them as a trail. The path led me to a clearing. At its center stood a stone circle, the gray rocks weathered and covered in moss. Symbols were etched into their surfaces similar to the ones on the trees. In the middle of the circle was a pit, its edges uneven and crumbling. The air around it felt charged like the static before a storm. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the frigid air. The pit seemed impossibly deep, its darkness swallowing the weak light of my flashlight. A faint hum emanated from within, the same sound I'd heard on the radio. As I stared into the void, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the figure closer now. Its features were still obscured, its body a shadow against the snow, but its eyes too, pinpricks of pale flickering light, locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, a pressure that pushed against every fiber of my being. The hum from the pit grew louder, resonating in my skull. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as I tried to put distance between myself and the figure, but it didn't follow. It simply stood there watching, and then without warning, it raised a hand and pointed not at me but at the journal in my pack. The realization hit me like a bolt of ice. This wasn't about the map or the tower or even in the forest. It was about the journal. I turned and ran, the figure remaining motionless as I fled. The sound of my footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness, my breath hitching with each frantic step. When I finally reached the tower, I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, slamming the hatch shut behind me. The journal was on the desk, its leather cover worn and unassuming, but it wasn't just Eddie's story anymore. It was mine too. The journal sat on the desk, daring me to open it again. Its pages felt heavier than they had any right to be, weighted with the chaos of Eddie's experiences and my own unraveling. Whatever I had seen in the clearing, it wasn't done with me. The figure's silent gesture toward the journal played in my mind on a loop. The question wasn't what it wanted, it was why it hadn't taken it or me yet. I flipped through Eddie's entries again, searching for clarity. His words, once chaotic and frenzied, now felt methodical. He had been documenting something larger, piecing together fragments of an incomprehensible puzzle. March 24th. The pit wasn't natural, something carved it. Something hold the symbols, the humming, they pull at you. The map was my warning. If you see the X, don't go, don't let it know you've seen the X. The pit, the map wasn't just a clue, it was a test, and I had failed. The rest of the day passed in restless silence. I busied myself with routine checks, scanning the forest for smoke, for movement, for anything that might explain what was happening, but the forest offered nothing. Just an expanse of white and green, indifferent to my panic. The radio stayed silent even as I adjusted the frequency and tried to reach Frank. His absence was unnerving, leaving me untethered to any sense of normalcy. My fingers hovered over the handset, debating whether to keep trying or to let the silence speak for itself. When the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I secured the tower for the night. The hatch was locked, the floodlight ready. I set the rifle within arm's reach and stared out the window as the darkness crept in. The knocking began at midnight. Knock, knock, knock. It was rhythmic, deliberate, louder than it had ever been. My pulse quickened as I gripped the rifle and approached the window. The flashlight beam swept over the stairs, but they were empty. Then the scraping began. It started faint, a subtle scratching against the wood, like nails dragged over the surface, but it grew louder, closer, until it sounded as though it was coming from every side of the tower. I backed into the cabin, my breath ragged, the rifle shaking in my hands. The journal sat on the desk, its presence almost mocking. My mind raced with Eddie's warnings: don't look, don't respond, don't break the rules. The scraping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, an oppressive void that pressed against my chest. And then I heard it, footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate steps, each one resonating through the structure. They climbed slowly, methodically, as though savoring the ascent. My grip on the rifle tightened, my knuckles white. The steps stopped just below the hatch. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The hatch creaked slightly under pressure, as though something was testing its weight. I aimed the rifle at the tray pole, my finger hovering over the trigger, but the hatch didn't open. Instead, a low guttural the air vibrating through the walls and into my chest. It was the same sound I had heard at the pit, amplified and suffocating. My vision blurred as the sound seemed to pierce my thoughts, pulling at something deep inside me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I woke up on the floor, the rifle beside me. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin. My head throbbed and my limbs felt heavy, as though I had been drugged. The journal was open on the desk, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. I didn't remember opening it, but a new entry stared back at me in Eddie's frantic handwriting: March 25th. It will test you. It will take everything you have, but the journal is the key. Keep it close, keep it safe, don't let it leave the tower. My stomach churned. The words felt like a curse, binding me to the journal and its secrets. I slammed it shut and shoved it into my pack, determined to put as much distance between myself and the pit as possible. By mid-morning, I had made my decision. I would confront the X on the map. If the journal was the key, then the pit held the lock. Whatever was haunting this place wasn't going to stop until I faced it. The tray was crueling. The snow, deeper than before. The forest seemed darker, the trees more oppressive, as though they were leaning closer with each step. The markings on the trunks grew more frequent, their jagged shapes twisting in ways that made my eyes ache. When I reached the clearing, the pit seemed larger than before, its edges sharp against the snow, the symbols on The stones glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the low hum that emanated from within. I approached. Cautiously, the journal clutched tightly in one hand, the rifle in the other. The hum grew louder as I neared the edge, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat, and then I saw it. The figure stood on the opposite side of the pit, its form clearer than before. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally fluid, its eyes, those pinpricks of pale light, locked onto mine, and I froze. It raised a hand, pointing at the journal. The hum intensified, the air around me vibrating with its force. My grip on the journal faltered and it slipped from my hands, tumbling toward the pit. The figure moved, then its body a blur as it lunged for the journal, but I reacted first, grabbing it mid-fall and clutching it to my chest. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting as though in curiosity. The hum faded slightly, replaced by a low, guttural cheek growl. I backed away, the journal pressed tightly against me. The figure didn't follow, but its presence lingered, its eyes watching as I stumbled out of the clearing and back into the forest. When I returned to the tower, the sun was setting. My body ached, my mind racing with unanswered questions. The figure's reaction to the journal had been visceral, almost desperate. Whatever it wanted, the journal was the key, but Eddie's warnings echoed in my mind. Don't let it leave the tower. That night, as the wind howled and the knocking resumed, I stared at the journal on the desk, its presence heavier than ever. The figure's silent message was clear. It wouldn't stop until I gave it what it wanted, or until I found out why. The journal stared at me from the desk, its leather cover worn and unassuming, a sharp contrast to the chaos it had unleashed. The figure's reaction at the pit was burned into my mind. Whatever it was, it didn't want me, it wanted this, and yet Eddie's warning was clear. Don't let it leave the tower. But why? What did the journal contain that was so important? My instincts told me the answers were close, and the journal was the key, yet the questions gutted me. Why hadn't Eddie destroyed it? Why had I failed when I tried? And why did the forest feel alive when I carried it with me? I didn't have long to think as the sun began to set. The wind picked up and the now familiar knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder this time, resonating through the tower's wooden frame like a battering ram. My body tensed as I grabbed the rifle. I scanned the windows, but the forest remained eerily still. The flood light was my only weapon against the darkness, but Vic's warning echoed in my mind. Don't mess with the floodlight unless you have to. The knocking stopped. Silence fell, heavier than the wind or the creaking wood, and then from the radio came the sound I dreaded most. Static. For a moment I dared to hope it was Frank. Frank, are you there? I said, my voice trembling. The static crackled and a voice emerged. Not Frank. Spring back. The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with an inhuman resonance. My hands shook as I backed away from the radio. The journal sat on the desk, almost glowing in the dim light of the cabin. My gut told me it was connected to everything: the pit, the figure, the voices. But connected how? I opened it, flipping through the pages. Eddie's handwriting was frantic, his words barely legible in places, but one entry caught my eye. March 27th. The forest doesn't want us here. The journal isn't just a record, it's a tether to what I don't know, but I can't let it go. If it leaves, so do I. A tether. The word sent a chill down my spine. Was the journal holding me here, or holding something else? Back. The knocking resumed, faster and more violent, like fists pounding on the walls. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate ascending the stairs. My chest tightened as I aimed the rifle at the hatch, my finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped just outside the trapdoor. Then came the voice again, not from the radio this time, but from directly above me, vibrating through the wood. It's not yours to keep. The trapdoor creaked, the hinges straining under pressure. My breath caught in my throat as I prepared to fire. The journal seemed to pulse on the desk, its presence overwhelming. My instinct screamed at me to throw it out, to rid myself of the cursed thing, but Eddie's words echoed in my mind. If it leaves, so do I. The trap door rattled but didn't open. Instead, the voice shifted, softer now, almost coaxing. You don't belong here, let it go. I stood frozen, torn between two choices. If I kept the journal, the figure would never stop coming. If I let it go, I might surf, but at what cost? The trapdoor fell silent, but the tension in the air remained. My gaze shifted to the journal. I flipped through the pages again, searching for a clue, and found one final entry. March 28th. I made my choice. I threw it into the pit. It didn't save me, it only made it stronger. Eddie had tried to escape by giving it what it wanted, and he had failed. I stepped away from the desk, my thoughts racing. If the journal was a tether, then destroying it wasn't enough. It needed to be severed. But how the wind howled outside, rattling the tower. The floodlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to move, stretching toward the cabin. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal, its weight somehow heavier than before. Then it hit me. The pit. The journal had come from there, or at least it was tied to it. If I could destroy it, maybe I could return it to where it belonged, but doing so would mean venturing into the clearing again, facing whatever waited there. The thought sent a wave of fear through me, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The trek to the pit was agonizing. The snow seemed thicker, the forest darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The journal pulsed in my pack, an almost living thing, its presence a constant weight on my mind. When I reached the clearing, the pit loomed before me, its edges glowing faintly with the strange symbols carved into the stone. The humming was louder now, resonating in my bones, and there it was. The figure. It stood on the far side of the pit, its pale eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I stepped closer to the pit, the journal in my hands. The humming intensified, the air vibrating with energy. The figure tilted its head, watching as I approached. Return it. The voice was a whisper, yet it filled the clearing. I hesitated. Eddie's warning played in my mind. It didn't save me, it only made it stronger. But if keeping the journal meant staying trapped in this nightmare, then what choice did I have? I took another step toward the pit, the journal trembling in my hands. The figure remained still, its gaze unblinking. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I hurled the journal into the darkness. The moment the journal vanished into the pit, the humming stopped. The forest fell silent, the air still. The figure tilted its head again, then began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The pit began to glow, a deep pulsing red light emanating from its depths. The ground shook beneath my feet, and a sound unlike anything I had ever heard erupted from the void, a scream guttural and primal, filled with rage and triumph. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their trunks groaning as if alive. The symbols on the stones pulsed, their glow intensifying. The pit wasn't closing, it was opening. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as the forest seemed to come Alive around me, the trees moved their branches, clawing at me, the snow shifting. Under my feet the scream followed me, growing louder, more deafening with each step. When I reached the tower, I slammed the hatch shut and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The radio crackled to life and Frank's voice came through, urgent and panicked. "What did you do?" I threw it in. I stammered a long pause, then in a voice filled with dread, Frank said, "You've made it worse." The days that followed were a blur. The forest never went silent again. The knocking stopped, but the hum persisted. Faint yet constant, a reminder of the choice I had made when the snowmobile arrived to pick me up. Vic didn't say a word. He glanced at the tower, then at me, his expression grim. I climbed into the sled without looking back. As we sped away, I felt a strange weight in my bag. My heart sank as I opened it and found the journal, its leather cover pristine, its pages blank. The pit had returned it, and now it was mine. I've always been one for solitude. It's not that I don't like people, I just prefer my own company. Maybe that's why I became a park ranger. It's a job that suits someone like me, someone who doesn't mind spending hours on end in the quiet, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. My name is E.T. Granger, and I've been stationed at the Granite Hollow Preserve for a while now, a patch of wilderness tucked away in the southern Appalachians. It's not a place many have heard of, which is exactly how I like it. Granite Hollow isn't particularly large, but it's dense, thick with towering trees and underbrush that can swallow a person whole. The trails are narrow, winding through the forest like veins. Most days I'm alone with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel and the occasional chatter of wildlife. My duties are straightforward: keep the trails clear, check the campsites, and make sure no one's doing anything stupid like starting a fire in the wrong place. It was a routine day when I first noticed something was off. I was doing my usual round, starting from the trailhead near the ranger station. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the familiar landscape: old pines, thick ferns, and that constant sense of being watched by a thousand unseen eyes. I was halfway through my route when I found the first one. It was a deer, or at least it had been. Its body was torn apart, limbs scattered as if a child had thrown them in a tantrum. But what caught my eye wasn't just the violence of the scene, it was the precision the animal's head was missing, cleanly removed, not ragged like you'd expect from a predator. There was no blood trail, no signs of struggle, just a carcass laid out like some kind of offering. I radioed it in, but the connection was spotty. As usual, I managed to get through to my colleague Ben, who was stationed about 10 miles away. "Found a deer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's strange, you might want to take a look." Ben grunted something about coyotes, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He never was. Granite Hollow doesn't get much excitement, and most of the time that's a good thing, but this was different. I marked the spot on my map and continued on. My senses heightened. The forest was too quiet, the usual hum of insects and birds absent. It was as if everything around me was holding its breath. A few hours later I came across another one. This time it was a raccoon, its small body mutilated in the same precise manner as the deer. Once again, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just a dead animal with its head removed. placed neatly beside its body like some twisted jigsaw puzzle by the time I made it back to the station. It was late afternoon and I was more rattled than I'd like to admit. Ben hadn't shown up, which wasn't unusual. He had a habit of ignoring things he didn't deem important. But this felt important, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong that night. The wind howled through the trees, making the old cabin creak and groan. I sat by the radio trying to get in touch with Ben again, but all I got was static. I decided I'd head over to his station first thing in the morning. The unease gnawed at me, making it impossible to sleep. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my gear and set out. The trail to Ben's station was overgrown, not one I took often, but I knew it well enough. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the fog clung to the ground like a shroud. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the silence grew oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I was about halfway there when I saw it. At first I thought it was a boulder, large, gray, and unmoving, but as I got closer the shape resolved itself into something else entirely. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its body was massive, larger than a bear, with thick, sinewy limbs that ended in sharp, talon-like claws. Its skin was rough and gray like the bark of an ancient tree, and it had a hunch to its back that made it appear even more menacing. But what struck me most was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless expanse. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there as if it had been waiting for me. For a moment we were locked in a standoff, neither of us daring to move. Then, as if it had lost interest, the creature turned and lumbered off into the forest, its movements surprisingly silent for something so large. I watched it go, rooted to the spot by a mix of fear and disbelief. Once it disappeared into the underbrush, I forced myself to move, my legs shaky but functional. I knew I had to get to Ben's station, had to warn him, though I wasn't sure what I'd even say. When I finally reached the station, the door was ajar, swinging lazily in the wind. I called out for Ben, but there was no answer. The inside of the cabin was a mess, furniture, overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and then I saw it lying in the middle of the floor. Ben's body was torn apart just like the animals I'd found, but this time there was something more, a message of sorts. The walls were smeared with blood, drawn in symbols I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. And there in the center of it all was Ben's head, placed neatly on the table as if it were some kind of offering. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I needed to get out to call for help, but my mind was racing, unable to focus. That's when I heard it, the sound of something moving outside, something heavy. I grabbed Ben's shotgun from the rack, my hands trembling as I loaded it. The creature had followed me, or maybe it had been here all along, waiting for me to find its handiwork. I could feel its presence outside, lurking just beyond the door. I waited, the shotgun clutched tightly in my hands, my finger hovering over the trigger. The door creaked open slowly as if pushed by an invisible hand, and there it was, standing in the doorway, its faceless head tilted as if in curiosity. Time slowed. I aimed, squeezing the trigger, and the shotgun roared to life, the blast echoing through the cabin. The creature staggered back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound, a low rumbling noise that resonated in my chest, making my bones vibrate. It was a Sound that spoke of hunger, of a need that went beyond mere survival. I fired again, and this time the creature lunged forward faster than something of its size should be able to move. I barely had time to react before it was on me, its claws slashing through the air. I felt a sharp pain as it caught my arm, the force of the blow sending me crashing to the floor, but I wasn't about to go down without a fight. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a fallen chair and swinging it with all my strength. The wood shattered against the creature's hide, but it seemed unfazed, its focus entirely on me. I backed away, blood dripping from my arm, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature moved closer, and I knew I was out of time, out of options. In a last-ditch effort, I threw myself at the door, bursting out into the open air. I ran, branches whipping against my face, the sound of the creature close behind me. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop. The forest closed in around me, the trees becoming a blur as I pushed myself to the limit. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chase ended. The sound of the creature's pursuit faded, replaced by the deafening silence of the forest. I slowed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body screaming in protest. I turned, expecting to see it right behind me, but there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no sign of Ben. It was as if it had never existed at all. I stumbled back to the station, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I would tell them, didn't know how I would explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't finished. It would be. My name's Caleb Thompson, and back in 2019 I decided to take my RV up to P.1 National Park in Alberta for a much-needed break. Being a freelance photographer has its perks, but sometimes you need to step away from the hustle and just breathe in some fresh mountain air. I figured a solo trip would do me good, give me a chance to clear my head and maybe snap some shots of wildlife. I rolled into the campground late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the towering pines. Setting up was a breeze. I've done this 100 times. As I was hooking up the utilities, I noticed an old man a few sites down watching me. He had a weathered face, the kind that suggests he's seen more winters than he'd care to admit. I gave him a nod, but he just stared before turning back to his fire-friendly place. I muttered to myself. The first night was uneventful. I grilled up some burgers and settled in with a beer, gazing at the stars. The silence was comforting, a far cry from the constant noise of the city. Around midnight I heard rustling outside, probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer, no big deal. Still, I locked the door. Old habits. The next morning I decided to hit one of the trails I'd read about. Camera in hand, I set off, the crisp air filling my lungs. About a mile and I came across a sign that read "Trail closed." The path looked fine, no fallen trees or signs of erosion. Must be my lucky day, I thought, ignoring the sign. I continued on. Rules are more like guidelines. Right an hour later I stumbled upon an old cabin tucked away between the trees. It wasn't on any map. I had curiosity got the better of me. The place looked abandoned, windows boarded up, doors slightly ajar, probably not up to code. I chuckled. I took a few photos from the outside, but something pulled me to look inside. Pushing the door open, I was hit by the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was sparse, a table, a chair, and a rusty stove On the table lay a notebook. Flipping through it, I realized it was a journal filled with sketches of animals and handwritten notes about trapping and hunting. One page caught my eye, a detailed drawing of traps laid out in the forest, some dangerously close to public trails. That's not legal, I whispered. A creak from behind made me jump. Spinning around, I saw the old man from the campground standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and fixed on me. "Private property," he said flatly. "Sorry, I didn't know the door was open in I city. Folks never respect boundaries." He interrupted. His gaze shifted to the notebook in my hands. "Find anything interesting?" I set the notebook down carefully. "Just taking some photos. I'll be on my way." He stepped aside, allowing me to pass, but keeping his eyes on me. The whole time as I walked away, I could feel his stare piercing the back of my neck. "Well, that wasn't awkward at all," I mumbled. Back at the RV that evening, I couldn't shake the encounter. Something about the old man unsettled me. Maybe it was the traps or the fact that he was out there alone. I decided to let it go. After all, I came here to relax, not to get wrapped up in someone else's business. The next day I chose a different trail, one that was definitely open. The scenery was breathtaking. Crystal clear lakes, snow-capped peaks, the works. Lost in the beauty, I almost didn't notice the smell. It was faint at first, but as I continued it grew stronger, an acrid, rotten odor that made my stomach churn. Following the scent, I came across a gruesome sight, a deer carcass, or what was left of it. The body was mutilated, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, entrails scattered. This wasn't the work of a predator. It was too deliberate. My first thought was poachers, but this was excessive. I snapped a photo for evidence, thinking I should report it to the park rangers. As I lowered my camera, I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. Turning around, I saw a man I hadn't seen before. He was younger than the old man, maybe in his 40s, with unkempt hair and dirt-smudged clothes. "Not something you see every day," he said, nodding toward the carcass. "Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. You know anything about this?" He shrugged. "Could be wolves." I frowned. "Wolves don't do this. This is different." He smiled. "Oddly, nature has its ways." An uneasy feeling settled in my gut. "Well, I should get going. Be careful out there," he called as I walked away. "You never know what you might run into." Back at the campground, I headed straight to the ranger station, but it was closed. A sign on the door read out, "On patrol back tomorrow." "Great," I sighed. I decided to email the photos to the park main office. When I got back to the RV that night, sleep eluded me. Around 2 a.m. I heard scratching sounds outside, probably just a branch against the side, I told myself. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate steps circling the RV. My heartbeat quickened. I reached for the small kitchen knife I kept by the sink. Not exactly a weapon, but better than nothing. The footsteps stopped. Silence, then a thud against the door. I held my breath. Another thud, harder this time. Gathering my courage, I approached the door and shouted, "Who's there?" No response. I debated calling the police, but I knew cell reception was spotty at best out here. The thewing continued, more rhythmic. Now I decided to flick on the exterior lights. Peering through the window, I saw the younger man from earlier standing by the door, a sinister grin on his face. "Can I help you?" I yelled. He tilted his head. "Just thought you might want some company." "I'm fine, thanks." He laughed softly. "You shouldn't be out here all alone. Leave or I'll call the Authorities, he took a step back, his eyes never leaving mine. Suit yourself, he turned and vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light I packed up, deciding it was time to cut this trip short. As I secured the last of my gear, the old man appeared again, standing a few yards away. Leaving so soon, he asked. Yeah, change of plans, he nodded slowly. Be careful on the road, lots of twists and turns. Right. Thanks. I got into the RV and started the engine. As I pulled up, both men stood together watching me, their expressions unreadable. A shiver ran down my spine. Just get home, I told myself. About 10 miles down the winding mountain road, a figure darted out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the RV screeching to a halt. It was a woman, disheveled, with torn clothes and scratches covering her arms. Help me, she screamed. I opened the door and she scrambled inside. What's going on? They're coming, we have to go. Who? Before she could answer, a loud bang echoed from behind. I looked in the side mirror to see a pickup truck barreling toward us. Hold on, I floored the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, struggling to pick up speed on the steep incline. The truck gained on us, the grill almost touching the rear bumper. The woman was hyperventilating. They killed my friends. They're going to kill us. Who are they? Locals. They hunt people for sport. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. Are you serious? She looked at me with desperate eyes. Does it look like I'm joking? A gunshot rang out the back window, shattering. That's definitely not a joke. I circled, trying to make the RV a harder target. Up ahead, the road forked. Which way? To the nearest town. Left. I took the left, turned sharply, the tires skidding on loose gravel. The truck struggled to follow, but recovered quickly. Another shot hit the side mirror, spraying glass. Can you call for help? I shouted. No signal. Figures. An idea sparked. There's a bridge up ahead. Right. Yes, over the canyon. Hold tight. As we approached the bridge, I aimed for the narrow pedestrian walkway instead of the main road. The RV barely fit, scraping the sides. The truck couldn't follow. We made it across, but the RV was in bad shape. Steam billowed from under the hood. I pulled over. Once we were a safe distance away. Thank you, she gasped. What's your name? Maya. Caleb. What happened back there? She took a deep breath. My friends and I were camping. Those men showed up, said we were trespassing. We tried to leave, but they started hunting us. My stomach turned. We need to get to the authorities. She nodded. There's a town about 20 m from here. The RV groaned but started up again. We drove in tense silence, every shadow and distant sound putting us on edge. Half an hour later, we are rolled into a small town. I pulled up in front of the police station and we stumbled inside. An officer looked up from his desk. Can I help you? We relayed the events in rushed sentences. He listened, his expression unreadable. You say they were hunting you? Yes, Maya insisted. He leaned back. We've had reports about those men before. Locals call them the huntsmen, but we've never been able to catch them. Well, they're out there now. I said. They tried to kill us. He stood up. We'll send a patrol out. In the meantime, you two should stay in town over the next few hours. We gave detailed statements. Other officers came and went, whispering among themselves. Something felt off that evening as we were placed in a motel for our safety. I noticed the same pickup truck parked outside the station. Panic surged. They're here. Maya looked out the window, her face pale. We need to Leave now. We slipped out the back, sticking to the shadows. There's a bus station nearby, she whispered as we moved. Through the deserted streets, footsteps echoed behind us. We ducked into an alley. Pressing against the cold brick, two figures walked past, the old man and the younger one. They were talking in low voices. This is a small town, I whispered. They probably have eyes everywhere. Why are they doing this? Ma's voice quavered. Does it matter right now? We made it to the bus station only to find it closed. A schedule posted on the door showed the next bus wouldn't arrive until morning. Fantastic, I muttered. Got any other jokes? Maya tried to smile. Why did the scarecrow win an award? I whispered. She looked at me incredulously. What? Because he was outstanding in his field. She stifled a laugh. Really now? Hey, if we're going to die, might as well go out laughing. Footsteps approached. We hid behind a vending machine as a shadow stretched across the floor. Holding my breath, I gripped the useless cell phone in my pocket. The footsteps receded. We can't keep running like this, I said. Agreed. Maybe we can steal a car. Do you know how to hotwire? I sighed. How hard can it be? I've seen it in movies. We sneaked toward a parked car and I smashed the window with a rock. The alarm blared. So much for stealth. Maya groaned. Kid, and I fumbled with the wires, trying to recall any scene from an action movie that could help. The engine roared to life. Got it. We sped off just as the men emerged from around the corner, shouting and pointing. Any idea where we're headed? My asked. Far from here. After an hour of driving aimlessly, the adrenaline wore off. We need a plan, I admitted. There's a larger city about 2 hours east. We can get help there. Let's do it. As dawn broke, we reached the outskirts of the city. We headed straight to the main police department, hoping for better luck. Inside, we told our story once more. This time, the officers took us seriously. They dispatched to the town and promised to investigate the so-called Huntsman. Weeks later, I was called back to identify suspects. They had arrested several men, including the old man and his accomplice. Turns out they had been part of a local extremist group targeting campers and hikers. In the final report, I learned the old man's name was Richard Harlan, a former hunter disgruntled by the influx of tourists he believed were ruining the natural landscape. His motivations were twisted, a delusional attempt to protect the wilderness by eliminating those he deemed intruders. Maya and I testified in court, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. The evidence was overwhelming, including the gruesome discovery of multiple bodies in makeshift graves around the area. It's a stark reminder of how quickly a peaceful retreat can turn into a nightmare. I still go camping, but now I'm a bit more cautious about the trails I choose. It began with a decision I made on a whim. My name is Silas Danforth, a software developer who had been working too many hours and spending too little time outside the monotonous routine of coding and staring at screens for days on end had taken its toll on my mind. So when a friend mentioned an old hiking trail in the deep woods of Oregon, I thought it might be the perfect antidote to the drug lie of my daily life. I wasn't much of a hiker, but the allure of the outdoors, the crisp air, and the chance to clear my head appealed to me. Besides, the trail was reputed to be peaceful, far from the meeting crowd, just what I needed. That was last Monday, and I was to set out by the weekend. I invited a colleague, Ezra Polk, to join me. Ezra was an ex-Marine turned network administrator and he eagerly accepted the invitation if there was anyone who could handle the wilderness it was. We left Portland early Saturday morning, the dense fog clinging to the ground as we drove deeper into the heart of the Oregon wilderness. The trail was called Silver Ridge, an old logging path now overgrown with thick underbrush long forgotten by most, but there was something else about it, an odd reputation, a place where hunters went missing, where echoes didn't quite sound right, and where the forest seemed to swallow the light. These were stories I didn't believe in, and Ezra laughed them off as campfire tales. The trailhead was unmarked, just as Ezra had warned. That's the charm, he said, grinning as we slung our packs over our shoulders and started the hike. The first few hours were everything I had hoped for: the fresh scent of pine, the crunch of leaves beneath our boots, and the song of birds that flitted through the canopy. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By midday we reached a clearing where we stopped for lunch. The sun barely pierced through the thick foliage, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We sat in silence, chewing on our sandwiches, until Ezra broke it with an odd observation. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I strained my ears, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. "Hear what? That's just it," he said. "Nothing, no birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. It's like the forest is holding its breath." I shrugged it off, chalking it up to his paranoia, and we continued on. The trail grew steeper as we ascended Silver Ridge, the air colder and the trees thicker. By late afternoon we were both feeling the burn in our legs, but the beauty of the untouched wilderness drove us onward. It was around then that we noticed the tracks Ezra was the first to spot them, deep, heavy prints in the earth that seemed to appear and disappear along the trail. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, wide and clawed like a bear's, but larger, much larger, and the spacing between them was off, as if whatever made them was moving with an unnatural gait. "Must be a bear," Ezra said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "A big one, but I wasn't so sure." The prints were strange, as though the creature walked on two legs instead of four. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but I said nothing. We pressed on, both of us growing more uneasy with each step. The light began to fade, and we realized we needed to find a place to camp. We settled on a small plateau, a natural shelter formed by the overhanging rock. It felt safe enough, though that nagging unease still quite at me. We set up our tents and built a fire, its warm glow a small comfort in the growing darkness. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came an oppressive silence, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only living thing for miles. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the forest, every snap of a twig jolted me awake. Around midnight Ezra shook me from my half-sleep, his face pale. "There's something out there," he whispered. I listened, and there it was, a low rhythmic thumping, like the sound of a massive heartbeat coming from deep within the woods. It wasn't close, but it was moving, circling our camp. Ezra grabbed his rifle, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "Stay here," he ordered, and despite my instincts I obeyed. I watched as he disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight bouncing through the darkness. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. Minutes felt like hours as I sat by the fire, clutching a makeshift club, a thick branch I had found earlier. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Silence returned, more profound than before my breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear any sign of Ezra, but there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I waited, heart pounding, until I could take it no longer. Grabbing my flashlight, I ventured into the woods, calling out for Ezra. My voice echoed eerily, distorted by the thick trunks of the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless rows of trees. Then I saw it. Something on the ground. I moved closer, my heart racing as the light illuminated a patch of dirt-stained dark blood. Ezra's rifle lay nearby, bent as if something had snapped it in two. I stumbled back, horror gripping me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what could have done this. Then I heard the noise again, that rhythmic thumping. Closer now, coming from all directions. Panic set in and I ran crashing through the underbrush, the flashlight bouncing wildly. The sound followed, relentless as though it was hunting me. I burst into the clearing, only to stop dead in my tracks. In the middle of the space stood a figure, or what I thought was a figure. It was massive, towering over me, covered in matted fur that seemed to absorb the light. It stood on two legs, hunched forward with arms that almost touched the ground. Its face was a nightmare, a twisted amalgamation of human and beast, with a snout like a wolf's and teeth that glint in the light. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as it regarded me with an almost curious tilt of its head. For a moment it just stood there, as it deciding what to do with me. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it lunged. I barely had time to react. I threw the branch, a pathetic attempt to defend myself, and turned to run. The creature's roar, a deep bone-rattling sound, filled the air, but I didn't stop. I sprinted through the tree's branches, slashing at my face, the thumping once again behind me growing louder, faster. Somehow I made it back to the plateau, the fire still burning low. I grabbed my pack and ran, not caring about the trail or direction, just needing to get away. The sound followed, echoing through the woods, until finally it began to fade. I didn't stop running until I saw the lights of my car parked at the trailhead. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and nearly dropped them before finally getting the door open. I jumped and started the engine and tore down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The forest, a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I collapsed into a cheap motel bed that night, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over. The next morning I went to the local authorities. They found the camp, found Ezra's body mauled beyond recognition. They didn't believe my story at first, but when they saw the tracks, the broken rifle, the blood, they had no choice. They launched a search, but the creature was never found. I left Oregon the next day, never to return, they said. It must have been a rogue bear, a freak of nature, but I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a bear, and as much as I tried to forget it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there waiting. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I'd survived, and that was enough. The authorities would handle the rest. It started as any other day, which is probably how these things always begin, though I've never been one to dwell on patterns or fate. My name's Keith Remington, and I've been a park ranger at Devil's Ridge for longer than I care to remember. The job's decent, though the pay isn't much to brag about. It's a quiet life which suits me fine, but maybe that's why what happened hit me so hard. You see, Devil's Ridge isn't your typical hiking spot. It's Remote, rough and isolated, drawing in the kind of people who prefer to keep their secrets buried under pine needles and boulders. I never minded the quiet or the solid solitude. Grew up in a big city. Noise all around, people everywhere, and none of it ever felt like home. My dad was a mechanic, rough around the edges, and my mom passed when I was still a kid. The city chewed him up and spat him out, and I guess that's why I left it behind. The woods seemed more honest. Nature's tough, but it doesn't lie to you. I was doing my rounds that morning, the kind of mundane task you could sleepwalk through. The old trail down by the eastern slope had been getting overgrown, and I figured I'd do a bit of clearing while I was out. There nothing too exciting, just the usual dead branches and undergrowth. Creeping onto the path, the air was crisp, cool enough to make me zip up my jacket. And the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I'd walked the trail 1,000 times, knew every bend and dip, every gnarled root sticking out of the ground, but about halfway through I noticed something odd. There was a smell in the air, faint at first, but unmistakable. The stench of decay, heavy and rotten, like something that had been left to fester under the sun. I paused, trying to pinpoint the source, but the wind was against me, carrying the smell away just as I thought I had it. That's when I saw the tracks. Now, I'm not one to get spooked easily, but these tracks weren't like anything I'd seen before. They were deep, almost claw-like, with a strange pattern that didn't match any animal native to these parts. One knelt down for a closer look, tracing the outline with my fingers. The soil was disturbed, as if whatever made the prints had some weight behind it, but the spacing between them didn't make sense. Too wide for a bear, too narrow for anything else I could think of. The rational part of me said it was just an animal I hadn't encountered before, maybe a stray mountain lion or a wolf. The wolves were rare in these parts, but something about those tracks unsettled me, gnawing at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I stood up, shaking off the unease, and continued down the trail, keeping my eyes peeled. The smell grew stronger the further I went, thick and nauseating, until it hung in the air like a shroud. I rounded a bend and stopped dead in my tracks. There, about 20 feet off the trail, was a mass of tangled fur and flesh, half buried under a fallen tree. At first I thought it was a deer, maybe a bear, but as I approached, the details became clearer. The body was mangled beyond recognition, torn apart by something with more ferocity than I'd ever seen. The flesh was shredded, bones exposed, and there were patches of fur clinging to the carcass that didn't match any animal I knew. But the worst part was the head, or what was left of it. The skull was caved and crushed with a force that didn't seem possible. I'd seen dead animals before. Nature can be brutal, but this was different. This was violence for the sake of it, a senseless, wild rage that didn't fit with any predator's behavior. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. The creature had been partially dragged, leaving a trail of blood and fur that disappeared into the denser part of the forest. My gut told me to turn back, report it, and let someone else deal with it, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what could do something like this. I pulled out my radio and called it in, giving a brief description, and my location dispatch told me they'd send someone out, but it would take a while. This part of the park was remote, and the nearest ranger station was a good 30 miles away. I decided to follow the trail. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and Rustling leaves faded until there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The trail led me deeper into the woods through a part of the park that wasn't on any map I knew it existed. Of course, but it wasn't a place we encouraged visitors to go. Too dangerous. Too easy to get lost. As I pushed through the underbrush, I came across something that stopped me. Cold, a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, their branches twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers. In the center of the clearing was a structure, if you could call it that. It looked like a den built from the bones and branches with animal skins stretched across the top. The stench of decay was overpowering here, nearly choking me as I approached. I should have turned back, I knew that, but I didn't. The den was empty, but the signs of recent activity were clear. The ground was littered with bones, some animals, some not, and scattered among them were objects that shouldn't have been there. Pieces of clothing, a torn backpack, and most chilling of all, a small bloodied shoe. It belonged to a child. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, but before I could react, I heard something, a low guttural sound coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, and saw it. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It stood on two legs, but its body was twisted, hunched, covered in matted fur that seemed to WY as it moved. Its arms were long, almost dragging on the ground, ending in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. But it was the face that froze me in place, elongated, almost canine, but with features that were disturbingly human. It stared at me, unblinking, as if sizing me up. I didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping that it would lose interest and disappear back into the trees, but it didn't. Instead, it let out a sound, a deep primal noise that resonated through my bones and started to advance. I backed up slowly, trying not to provoke it, but I knew it was pointless. This thing was a predator, and I was in its territory. I reached for my gun, only to realize I'd left it in the truck, thinking I wouldn't need it for routine trail maintenance. A rookie mistake that I might not live to regret. The creature moved closer, and I knew I had to do something, anything, to survive. Without thinking, I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it with all my strength. It connected with the creature's side, but the impact barely phased it. Instead, it seemed to enrage the beast, and it lunged at me, claws outstretched. I dodged to the side, feeling the wind from its swing brush against my face. I scrambled backward, looking for anything that could help me, but the clearing was empty, barren of anything useful. The creature circled me, its eyes locked on mine, and I knew it was toying with me, enjoying the hunt. Desperation took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted through the trees, branches whipping in my face, feet pounding the earth. As I fled, the creature was behind me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step, but I didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't think. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the trees and into a small ravine. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard. The impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there dazed, but the sound of the creature closing in snapped me back to reality. I rolled over, ready to keep running, but as I did, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There at the base of the ravine, half buried in the mud, was an old trap, a bee trap, rusted and forgotten, with jagged metal teeth that still looked sharp enough to sever a limb. An idea formed in my mind, a last desperate plan that had no guarantee of working. I scrambled to my feet and positioned myself behind the trap, hoping the creature would follow me down. I picked up a nearby rock and hurled it at the tree, the noise echoing through the ravine. The creature drawn by. The sound came crashing through the trees. Eyes locked on me. It didn't notice the trap had charged, and at the last possible second I dove to the side. The creature stepped forward and the trap snapped shut with a sickening crunch, its jaws clamping down on the creature's leg. The beast let out a sound that could have been a roar or something worse and thrashed wildly, trying to free itself. I didn't wait to see if it would succeed. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached my truck parked at the edge of the trail. I radioed for backup, breathless and shaking, and waited, engine running, for the others to arrive. When they did, we went back to the ravine, guns drawn, expecting the worst, but the creature was still there, trapped and unmoving, blood pooling around its leg. It was dead. The aftermath was a blur, reports, questions, and disbelief, but the creature's body didn't disappear, and the evidence was undeniable. Whatever the thing was, it was real, and it was dead. As I left the park that night, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that whatever horrors lurked in those woods, at least one of them wouldn't be coming back, and that was enough for me. Machine. My name's Garrett Thompson, and in 2017 I decided to take my RV up to the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. After years of desk work, I figured a solo trip into nature might clear my head. I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys a good joke and a cold beer, so the open road seemed like the perfect escape. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for: winding roads, crisp mountain air, and the kind of silence you can't find in the city. I'd parked the RV at different spots each night, grilling up whatever I caught during the day. It was simple living, and I was content. One afternoon I pulled into a small town called Millbrook to stock up on supplies. The place had one general store, a diner, and not much else. Inside the store, an old man behind the counter eyed me as I picked up some essentials not many folks pass through here, he remarked. Just enjoying the scenery, I replied, placing a few items on the counter. He nodded slowly. Be careful up there in the mountains, easy to get lost. Thanks for the concern, but I've got a map and a GPS, I said with a grin. He didn't smile back. Maps don't help when the paths change. I paid and left, chalking up his warning to small town superstition. Back on the road, I couldn't shake his words. The paths change sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. I laughed at it, thinking maybe he was trying to spook the outsider. That evening I found a secluded spot near a clearing. The view was spectacular with the sun setting over the peaks. I set up a campfire and settled in with a steak and a bottle of local brew. As the stars emerged, I pulled out my guitar and strummed a few chords. Life was good. Around midnight I heard rustling in the bushes, probably a raccoon or some other critter. I tossed a small rock in the direction of the noise. Find your own dinner, I muttered. The rustling stopped and all was quiet again, too quiet even the usual sounds of the forest seemed to hush. I shrugged it off and headed into the RV to get some sleep. Sometime later a loud thud jolted me awake. It sounded like something hit the side of the RV, grabbing a flashlight. I stepped outside. The fire had died down and darkness enveloped the campsite. Hello, I called out, feeling a bit foolish. No response. I circled The RV shining the light into the trees, nothing seemed out of place. Must have been a branch falling or maybe an animal brushing past. Deciding it was nothing, I headed back inside just as I was drifting off. I heard a faint scratching at the door. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't normal animal behavior. I reached into the drawer next to my bed and pulled out a hunting knife. Not exactly a firearm, but it made me feel a bit safer. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound assertive. Silence. I mustered the courage to open the door, crack the flashlight beam cut through the night, revealing nothing, just the empty campsite. I locked the door securely this time and double-checked the windows. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually exhaustion took over. Morning light filtered through the blinds, and I felt a bit silly about the whole ordeal. Probably just nerves from being alone out here. I decided to head into the next town for a proper breakfast and maybe some human interaction. Driving along the mountain roads, I came across a hitchhiker. He was tall, lanky, with unkempt hair and clothes that had seen better days. Normally I wouldn't pick up strangers, but out here it seemed the neighborly thing to do. "Need a lift?" I asked, pulling over. He nodded and climbed in without a word. Up close, I noticed his hands were dirty and there was a faded scar across his cheek. "Headed into town?" I inquired. "Just up the road," he replied tersely. I tried making small talk. "Name's Garrett. Beautiful area, isn't it?" He glanced at me briefly. "Name's Owen. Been out here long?" I pressed. "Long enough." "Not much for conversation." I thought we drove in silence for a few minutes. Out of nowhere he asked, "You alone up here?" Something about the question put me on edge. "Just passing through, meeting some friends later." I lied. He smirked. "Not many friends around these parts." One gripped the steering wheel a bit tighter. "Well, they're meeting me later today." He didn't respond. As we approached a fork in the road, he pointed left. "Take that turn." I knew from my map that the town was straight ahead. Thought town was this way. "Shortcut," he insisted. Every instinct told me not to trust him. "I think I'll stick to the main road." In a flash he pulled out a knife and pressed it against my side. I said, "Take the turn." My mouth went dry. "All right, easy now." I turned the RV down the dirt path. Trees grew denser and the road narrowed. My mind raced, looking for a way out. "Pull over here," Owen ordered. I complied, stopping near a clearing. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled. "Funny how folks like you think you can just stroll through our land. Look, I don't want any trouble." He motioned for me to get out. As we stepped outside, I noticed 3 more men emerging from the trees. They all carried weapons, knives, bats, and one had a rusted axe. Well, Owen brought us a visitor," one of them sneered. I was surrounded. Running didn't seem like an option, but I had to try something. "Guys, I'm sure we can work something out," I offered. "Empty your pockets," Owen demanded. I tossed him my wallet and phone. "Take it, just let me go." They rifled through my belongings. "City boy like you must have more than this," the one with the axe said. "That's all I have," I insisted. Owen stepped closer. "We saw your RV. Bet there's plenty more inside." They herded me back towards the vehicle. My mind raced for a plan. As Owen reached for the door handle, I remembered the flare gun I kept in the glove compartment. "Hey, if you're looking for valuables, there's a safe under the bed." I lied. They paused. "Show us," Owen ordered. I climbed into the RV, the men close behind near the driver's seat. I swiftly grabbed the flare gun and spun around. "Back off," I shouted, aiming it at them. They hesitated for a moment before bursting into laughter. "A flare gun, that's cute, Owen." Mocked without thinking, I fired. The flare hit Owen square in the chest, igniting his shirt. He screamed. Desperately trying to pat out the flames, chaos erupted. The confined space worked. To my advantage, I lunged past the others, shoving one into the kitchenette. He knocked over the stove and a fire started to spread. I dashed out of the RV. Slamming the door behind me, smoke began to billow from inside. The men were trapped, but not for long. I sprinted towards the woods, hearing them curse and shout behind me. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the underbrush. "Get him!" one of them roared. My heart pounded in my ears. I spotted a rocky incline ahead and scrambled up, hoping to lose them in the terrain. Reaching the top, I glanced back. They were in pursuit, but the fire had slowed them down. Smoke rose from the RV, a beacon in the forest. I needed to find help. Remembering the map, I knew there was a ranger station a few miles east. I pressed on, legs burning, lungs aching. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a dirt road. Relief washed over me as I spotted a ranger's truck parked ahead. "Help!" I shouted, waving my arms. A woman in uniform stepped out, hand hovering near her sidearm. "What's going on?" "There's a group of men tried to rob me. My RV is on fire," I panted. She radioed for backup. "Calm down, tell me exactly what happened." As I recounted the events, she listened intently. "All right, get in the truck, we'll head back that way." We drove cautiously, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Near the smoking remains of my RV, there was no sign of the men. "Stay here," she instructed, stepping out with her weapon drawn. Minutes passed like hours. Finally she returned. "They're gone. We'll get a team to search the area." She took me to the nearest station where I filed a report. Officers assured me they'd do everything they could to find the perpetrators. Over the next few days they found traces, footprints, discarded items, but the men had vanished into the wilderness. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a lingering unease. Insurance covered the RV, but the experience had cost me more than possessions. Weeks later, I received a call from the local authorities. They'd identified one of the men from fingerprints in the RV. "His name's Owen Price." The officer informed me, "Local troublemaker with a record. Seems he leads a small group that's been causing issues in the area." "Have you caught them?" I asked. "Not yet, but we're closing in." The thought of Owen still out there kept me on edge, but knowing his name gave me a strange sense of closure. In the end, I was lucky to have escaped. The open road had called to me, but it also taught me that not all who wander are lost. Some are hunting. Back, the old mill on the outskirts of Greenwood had always been a point of local lore. It was a place mothers warned their children about, a crumbling relic from an era no one wanted to remember. As the town sheriff, it fell on me to check up on it now and then, particularly when the kids got too curious or when some vagabond decided it was a good place to squat. But lately it had been different. An unsettling quiet, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. I'm Sheriff Hal Branson, born and raised in Greenwood. I know this place better than the back of my hand. My dad was the sheriff before me, and I guess it was expected I'd follow in his footsteps. Greenwood is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, but I can't say it's given me much in the way of excitement. It's the small things, breaking up bar fights, checking up On the Ultimers responding to the odd domestic disturbance that's my life. The mill hadn't been in operation for decades after the last owner, Mr. Higginson, died. It fell into disrepair. No one bought it, no one cared. It was just another forgotten part of Greenwood's history. But in the past month, strange things started happening. Livestock went missing, dogs turned up dead, malt ripped apart. The first couple of reports didn't raise any alarms. We chalked it up to wild animals, coyotes, maybe a bear, something from the woods. But then people started disappearing. It was subtle at first. Drifter here, a transient there, no one who'd be missed by anyone important. But then it was Darlene Rogers, a teacher at the local elementary school. She didn't show up for work one morning. Her car was found on the edge of town, not far from the mill. No sign of her. That's when folks started whispering, looking at me like I was supposed to do something. But what could I do? I didn't have anything to go on, no leads, no clues. That's when I decided to go out to the mill myself. I took Deputy Keith Hanley with me, a good kid fresh out of the academy. He was eager, but this job would eat away at that soon enough. We drove out in the cruiser, the sun just beginning to dip below the tree line. The mill looked even more decrepit than I remembered, a hulking shadow against the orange sky. The air was thick with the smell of rot, a stench so pungent it made my stomach turn. We circled the building, flashlights in hand, weapons drawn. Keith was jumpy, but I couldn't blame him. The place had an aura like something wrong had seeped into the very wood and stone. We found a door on the north side, half off its hinges, leading into the dark. Inside it was worse. The beams creaked overhead and the floor was slick with some kind of oily residue. The walls were covered in old graffiti, but there was something else. Two symbols carved into the wood, things I didn't recognize. Keith shined his light on them, and I saw his hand trembling. What do you think that is, Sheriff? He asked, his voice shaky. Nothing good, I replied. Let's keep moving. We pushed further in, the air getting colder, more oppressive. The smell of rock grew stronger, making it hard to breathe. We found a staircase leading down to the basement, a place I didn't even know existed. The steps groaned under our weight as we descended, the darkness seeming to swallow our lights. At the bottom we found it, bodies, dozens of them strewn about like rag dolls. Some were fresh, others not so much. Their faces were frozen in terror, their mouths open in silent screams. The stench was unbearable, the air thick with decay, but it wasn't the sight of the dead that shook me the most. It was what was doing this to them in the corner, hunched over. A fresh kill was something I can only describe as a nightmare. It wasn't human. At least not anymore. It had the body of a man, but was twisted, deformed. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched over a skeletal frame. Its fingers were long, clawed, stained with blood, and its face was a twisted mockery of a human's, with a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth. It didn't notice us at first, too focused on its meal, but then Keith, poor Keith, gasped a sharp, involuntary sound that echoed through the basement. The creature's head snapped up, its eyes hollow black voids locked onto us. It moved fast, too fast for something so emaciated. Keith fired his weapon, emptying his clip, but the bullet seemed to do nothing. It was on him in seconds, tearing into him with those claws, ripping him apart like paper. His screams filled the air, a sound I'll never forget. I didn't hesitate. I fired my own weapon. aiming for its head, its heart, anything that looked like it might kill it, but it just kept coming. I backed up, tripping over the bodies, my mind racing. There was no way out. This monster was going to kill me just like it killed Keith, like it killed all those people. But then I saw it, a rusty iron rod sticking out of the floor. I grabbed it, swinging with all my might as the creature lunged at me. The rod connected with its skull, a sickening crunch filling the air. It staggered, giving me just enough time to drive the rod into its chest. It let out a gurgling sound, clawing at the rod, trying to pull it out. I didn't stop. I kept pushing, driving it deeper until it finally collapsed. The thing twitched a few times, then went still. I waited, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. When it didn't move again, I fell back, exhausted, covered in blood, some of it mine, most of it not. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the thing, at the mess it had made, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over there. Or more than there had to be. The town wouldn't be safe until they were all gone. I stood up, wiped the blood from my face, and walked out of that basement. I'd be back, not tonight, but soon, with more men, more guns. We'd clean this town up once and for all. The creature's body was left where it fell. I made sure of that when I returned with backup. It was still there, cold and lifeless, a twisted husk of what it once was. There was no question in anyone's mind what I'd seen, what I'd done. It was all real. Greenwood was never going to be the same, but at least for now it was safe. My name is Lucas Donnelly, and back in 2016 I decided to take my RV up to the Adirondack Mountains in New York City. Life had been squeezing me like a vice, and I figured a weekend surrounded by trees instead of traffic might just be the reset button I needed. Now I'm not exactly Bear Grylls. The closest I've come to wilderness survival is navigating a blackout during a Netflix binge, but I thought, why not fresh air, quiet nights, maybe even a campfire if I could figure out how to light one without singing my eyebrows off. I stocked up on the essentials: a cooler full of beer, a bag of chips, and a GPS that I prayed wouldn't lose signal. The drive was smooth, and before long I was winding through roads canopied by towering pines, the kind of scenery that makes you wonder why anyone ever invented skyscrapers. I found a campsite that was perfect, secluded but not isolated, with a clear view of a serene lake that looked like it had been ripped from a postcard. As I set up my RV, a couple of hikers passed by. They waved and one shouted, "Nice rig." "Thanks," I called back. "Got it on sale, probably because it doesn't come with How to Survive the Wild manual." They laughed and continued down the trail. Friendly folks, I thought. Maybe this outdoor thing wouldn't be so bad after all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I managed to get a small fire going. Only burned myself twice, which I considered a win. I settled into a camp chair, beer in hand, and watched as the stars began to poke holes in the darkening sky. Just then a man emerged from the trees. He was in his late 40s, rugged looking, with a beard that could house a family of sparrows. He wore a flannel shirt and carried a hefty backpack. "Evening," he said with a nod. "Evening," I replied. "Care for a beer?" "Don't mind if I do." He sat down across from me and took the can I offered. "Name's Hank Lucas," I said, raising my can. "Cheers." We chatted for a bit. Hank was a local, knew the mountains like the back of his callous hand. He told me about the best Fishing spots, the trails with the best views, and the ones to avoid if I didn't want to meet a bear up close and personal. Not that the bears are your biggest concern, he added, taking a swig. Oh yeah, what should I be worried about? Killer squirrels, I chuckled. He looked at me, eyes glinting in the fur light. Some folks around here have gone missing. Good. People who knew these Woods. I raised an eyebrow. Missing like they got lost? He shook his head slowly like something took them. I waited for the punchline, but it never came. You're messing with me, right? He shrugged. Believe what you want, just keep your eyes open. With that cryptic advice, he stood up. Thanks for the beer, anytime, I replied, watching as he disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, the crackling fire suddenly sounding louder in the quiet night. I shook off the unease. Probably just trying to spook the city guys till I decided to turn, and I locked the RV door, habit more than necessity, and settled into bed. The sounds of the forest were oddly soothing, leaves rustling, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl. I drifted off, dreaming of nothing in particular. A loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding. Silence. I told myself it was probably a branch falling. Just as I was about to lie back down, there was another thud, this time accompanied by a scraping sound. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and shined it toward the window. Nothing but darkness. Who's there? I called out, instantly feeling foolish. No response. I took a deep breath. It's nothing, Lucas. Get a grip. But sleep wouldn't come. So I decided to make some tea. Maybe a warm drink would calm my nerves. As I waited for the water to boil, I heard faint footsteps circling the RV. My skin prickled. This was no raccoon. Okay, very funny, I shouted. You got me. Silence again. I wasn't about to go outside like some horror movie cliche. Instead, I dialed 911 on my cell, but of course no signal. Great, should have invested in that satellite phone. The footsteps stopped. I listened intently, every muscle tense. Then a whisper so faint I thought I imagined it come out and play. My throat went dry. This was not a prank. I searched the RV for anything that could serve as a weapon. My eyes landed on a cast iron skillet. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Clutching the skillet, I moved toward the driver's seat, planning to hightail it out of there. I turned the key. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. You're kidding me, I groaned, trying again. Nothing. A tapping on the window made me jump. A face pressed against the glass, distorted by a mask, a grotesque parody of a human face with a white painted grin. Need a hand? The figure asked in a sing-song voice. I backed away, panic surging. What do you want? Just some company, he replied, tilting his head. Look, man, I don't have anything valuable, just leave me alone. He laughed, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Oh, it's not about what you have. Suddenly another masked figure appeared at the opposite window, then a third at the back. They began rocking the RV, the vehicle swaying ominously. Desperate, I grabbed my keys and headed for the side door opposite the nearest figure. I flung it open and sprinted into the wood. Skillet still in hand, branches whipped against my face as I ran blindly, adrenaline fueling my strides. Behind me, footsteps and laughter echoed through the trees. Run, rabbit, run, one of them shouted. I zigzagged, hoping to lose them in the dense underbrush. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop, not if I wanted to live up. I saw a faint lighted cabin. I pushed myself harder, breaking through the tree line into a small clearing. It was a cabin, dilapidated, but standing. The door was ajar and light flickered from within. I hesitated, running into a creepy cabin in the woods didn't seem much safer, but I had no options. I slipped inside quietly, closing the door behind me. The interior was sparse: a table, some chairs, and a fireplace where a small fire crackled. An old man sat in a rocking chair. "Eyes closed, sir," I whispered. His eyes snapped open. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Please, I need help. There are people after me." He regarded me calmly. "Folks around here don't take kindly to trespassers." "Trespassers? I'm just camping." He chuckled. "Camping, huh? That's what they all say." I realized with sinking dread that this man was not going to help me. Footsteps approached the cabin. The old man smiled. "Sounds like your friends are here." I backed away as the door burst open. The masked figures entered, their laughter filling the small space. "Thanks for keeping him warm for us," one said to the old man. "Any time," he replied, settling back into his chair. They advanced on me. Cornered, I swung the skillet wildly, connecting with the shoulder. One stumbled back, but the other two closed and they grabbed me, forcing me to the ground. I struggled, kicking and shouting, but they were strong, feisty. One of them said, "This will be fun." From beneath his coat he pulled out a length of rope. In a surge of desperation, I bit down on the hand covering my mouth. The man yelped, loosening his grip. I broke free, grabbing a poker from beside the fireplace and swinging it with everything I had. It struck one of them square in the head. He dropped the mask, slipping off to reveal a man in his 30s with a scar across his cheek. The other two hesitated, surprised by my sudden offense. "Who's next?" I crawled, brandishing the poker. They exchanged glances. "Not worth it," one muttered. They retreated, slowly dragging their unconscious comrade with them. "We'll be seeing you," the last one said before disappearing into the night. I sank to the floor, chest heaving. The old man watched me with an unreadable expression. "You handled yourself better than most," he said. "Who are they?" I demanded. "Just some locals having fun. They tried to kill me." He shrugged. "Depends on your perspective. I wasn't sticking around for more cryptic conversations. Is there a phone here down the road?" "AP," he said, pointing vaguely. I didn't trust him, but staying wasn't an option. I stepped outside cautiously. The forest was silent, the men nowhere in sight. "Good luck," the old man called after me. I hurried down a dirt path that seemed to head toward the main road. The moon provided just enough light to navigate. After what felt like hours, I reached a small gas station. It looked closed, but a payphone hung on the wall outside. I lifted the receiver mercifully. There was a dial tone. I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. "Stay where you are," the operator instructed. "We'll send a unit right away." I hung up and leaned against the wall, exhaustion catching up to me. Headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as a police cruiser pulled in. An officer stepped out, a tall woman with a stern face. "You Lucas Donald?" "Yes, thank God you're here." Dispatch said you were attacked. "Yes, by 3 men in masks. They tried to." I stopped, unsure how to sum up the nightmare. She nodded. "Lead and get you to the station. File a report in the safety of the cruiser." I finally exhaled. At the station, I recounted everything. They took my statement, and I spent the rest of the night in a motel room. The police arranged the next morning. Detective Miller met me in the lobby. "We've been looking into your case," he said. "Got some news." "Did you catch them?" He sighed. We found your RV. It was burned to a shell. No sign of the menu. Described. My heart sank. What about the old man at the cabin? He raised an eyebrow. What cabin? I blinked. The cabin in the woods. An old man was there. He seemed to know them. He shook his head. There's no cabin in that area. It's just forest for miles. That's impossible. I was there. He gave me a sympathetic look. Sometimes trauma can play tricks on the mind. Frustration bubbled up. I'm not making this up. We'll keep investigating, he assured me. In the meantime, try to rest. I left the station feeling adrift. Was I losing my mind? Determined to find answers, I rented a car and drove back to the area. Probably not the smartest move, but I needed closure. I searched for hours, but there was no sign of the cabin or the clearing where I'd fought off the attackers. Just endless trees. As dusk approached, I was about to give up when I noticed a small cemetery tucked among the pines. Curiosity pulled me toward it. The headstones were old, some so worn the names were barely legible. One caught my eye. Elias Earl Watkins, 1902 to 1985. Beloved father and husband Earl Watkins. The name sent a chill through me. Could it be a coincidence? I heard a rustling behind me. Turning, I saw the old man from the cabin standing at the edge of the clearing. You shouldn't be here, he said softly. Who are you? I demanded. He smiled faintly. Just a caretaker. What's going on? Am I losing my mind? He shook his head. Sometimes the past and present intertwine in these woods. Old spirits linger. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Spirits, you're telling me? Ghosts tried to kill me. He met my gaze. Not all evils are bound by time. I took a step back. This is insane. He nodded toward the headstone. Earl and his boys did a lot of bad things, hurt a lot of people. Some say their souls can't find peace. I rubbed my temples. So what happened to me was what? A haunting. Call it what you will, but you've walked away. Few do. I wanted to scream, to demand logical answers, but deep down I knew I wouldn't get any. Why me? I asked. He shrugged. Sometimes the forest chooses. Before I could reply, he turned and vanished into the trees. I left the cemetery feeling more confused than ever. As I drove back to town, I tried to make sense of it all. Back at the motel, I did some digging. Online archives, old newspapers, anything that mentioned Earl Watkins. I found an article from 1952. Local man arrested in connection with disappearances. Earl Watkins and his sons were suspected in a series of missing persons cases, but were never convicted due to lack of evidence. They died in a house fire in 1985. I sat back, the pieces slowly clicking into place, whether it was lingering evil or some twisted reality I couldn't say, but I knew one thing: I'd stumbled into something far beyond a simple camping. Life. They told me to expect the unexpected when I signed up for search and rescue, but I thought they meant whether I thought they meant rough terrain, getting lost, maybe a sprained ankle or two. They didn't mean the sort of thing that happened last week on Jeremiah Blee. And I've been with the United States Forest Service for a good 10 years now. The job's got its ups and downs like any other, but I've always enjoyed the solitude, the challenge, and the satisfaction of bringing people back safe. It was routine until the day I got the call about a missing hiker up in the Cascades. The Cascades are unforgiving, steep, dense, and full of wildlife that doesn't take kindly to Humans I'd been on countless search missions, they're usually finding folks. Tired, cold, and embarrassed. This time it was different. The missing hiker was a guy named Tanner Beckett. His friends reported him missing after he didn't return from a solo trek. I met his friends at the trailhead. They were young college kids from Seattle out for a weekend adventure. They had the right gear, but not the experience. Tanner had decided to go off on his own to explore an unmarked trail. A stupid move, but not uncommon. I reassured them we'd find him, though I wasn't feeling as confident as I sounded. We set out early, the mist still clinging to the trees. My partner for the search was Nick Holstrom, a tough-as-nails veteran with a decade more experience than me. We moved quickly, knowing that the first 24 hours were critical. The forest was quiet, with only the sound of our boots on the ground and the occasional call on the radio. It was mid-afternoon when we found the first sign, a piece of torn fabric snagged on a branch, matching the description of Tanner's jacket. We marked the spot and pressed on, calling his name, hoping for a response. Nothing. Then we found the blood. It was smeared on a rock, dark and dried. Not a good sign. Nick and I exchanged looks but said nothing. We followed the trail, the forest closing in around us, the silence now oppressive. The blood trail led us to a small clearing. At first I thought we'd stumbled onto an animal kill site, but then I saw the shoe. A single hiking boot partially buried in the underbrush, no foot inside, just the boot. Nick was the first to speak. This doesn't look right, Jerry. No, I agreed, my stomach twisting. It doesn't. We spread out looking for more signs, and that's when we heard it, a low guttural noise that I can't quite describe. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and I've heard them all. It was something else. Did you hear that? Nick whispered, his hand going to the knife on his belt. Yeah, I said, pulling out my radio. BAS, this is BL. We've got something. Blood trail signs of a struggle. Need backup. The radio crackled, and I barely caught the response over the static. They were sending a team, but it would take time. We were on our own for now. The noise came again, closer. This time I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We moved slowly, carefully following the sound. It led us to another clearing, larger this time. In the center was a cave entrance, dark and foreboding. Do we go in? Nick asked, his voice tense. We don't have much choice, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But we go and prepared. We entered the cave, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of decay. We moved deeper, the light from the entrance fading behind us. Then we found Tanner, or what was left of him. His body was mutilated, parts scattered as if something had torn him apart. It was a scene out of a nightmare. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. Nick swore softly. What the hell did this? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking, but we need to get out of here now. We turned to leave, but the noise came again, echoing through the cave, louder, closer. We backed away, moving as quickly as we could without running, and then we saw it. The creature was like nothing I'd ever seen. It moved on all fours, its body covered in matted fur, muscles rippling beneath. Its face was almost human, but distorted, twisted. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to stare right through us. It lunged at us, and we fired bullets, tearing into its flesh. It barely flinched. Nick was faster, drawing his knife and slashing at it. As it closed the distance, it screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the cave, and I fired again, aiming for the head. The creature collapsed, twitching, and then lay still. We didn't wait to see if it would get up, we ran scrambling out of the cave, gasping for air. When we finally emerged into the light, we radioed for immediate evac and waited, guns drawn. I scanning the forest. The backup team arrived within the hour and we briefed them quickly. They went into the cave and when they came out they were pale and shaken. They found more bodies, not just tanners but others, hikers who had gone missing over the years. Their remains hidden deep within the cave. The creature's body was taken away for analysis, but I didn't stick around to hear the details. I'd had enough. Tanners friends were devastated and I did my best to comfort them, but what could I say? That he died at the hands of something out of a nightmare. We wrapped up the mission and I headed home, exhausted and haunted Ed by what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. The image of that creature, the sound of its wail, it all played over and over in my mind. The next day I got a call from my supervisor. They wanted a full report, every detail. I gave it to them, but I could tell they didn't believe half of it. How could they? It sounded insane. A week later, the official report came out. Tanner's death was attributed to a wild animal attack. The other bodies were said to be victims of the same. The creature was never mentioned. Nick and I were told to keep quiet, not to discuss what we'd seen. They didn't want to cause a panic. They said didn't want to scare people away from the forest, but I knew the truth. We both did. There was something out there, something dangerous and unknown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't alone. Life went on, and so did the job. I went back to search and rescue, though I was more cautious, more aware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. I kept my eyes open, always on the lookout for signs of something unnatural. One day a new recruit asked me about the craziest thing I'd ever seen on the job. I thought about telling him, but then I remembered the orders to keep quiet, the look on my supervisor's face when I gave my report, so I just smiled and said you wouldn't believe me if I told you, and that was the end of it. We went back to work and I tried to forget, but sometimes when I'm out in the forest, I still hear that noise, that guttural wail, and I wonder what else might be hiding out there waiting for its next victim. Nick and I never spoke about it again. We just did our job day in and day out, hoping we'd never have to face anything like that again. But deep down I knew the forest held more secrets than we could ever imagine, and that one day those secrets would come to light. The forest took Tanner Beckett, and it almost took us. I don't know what else is out there, but I know one thing for sure: the Cascades are a dangerous place, and sometimes it's best to leave the unknown alone. Now my name is Nolan Whitaker, and back in 2017 I decided to take my RV up to P.1 National Park in Alberta, Canada. I'd always been a fan of the great outdoors, and after years of crunching numbers as an accountant, I figured it was high time for a little adventure. You know what they say, all work and no play makes Jack a ham. Nolan, a dull boy, I had purchased a used RV in 1998 Winnebago with just enough quirks to keep life interesting. It wasn't the flashiest model on the lot, but it had character, much like its new owner, or so I like to think. Friends joked that I was going through a midlife crisis. I told them that if driving into the wilderness to find myself was a crisis, then sign me up. The drive to P.1 was spectacular. Mountains pierced the sky and the forests were a lush green. That seemed almost too vibrant to be real. I set up camp at a spot that was recommended by a fellow traveler I met at a gas station, Cascade Meadows. He had said it's less crowded and the views are to die for. Well, who was I to pass up a recommendation like that? Upon arrival, I noticed that the campground was indeed sparsely populated. A couple of RVs were scattered here and there, but for the most part it was quiet. Perfect. I parked the Winnebago on a flat patch overlooking a small lake. The water was so clear I could see the fish swimming near the bottom. Guess they won't be needing a lifeguard, I mused to myself. After settling in, I decided to take a hike along one of the less traveled trails nearby. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my backpack, and headed up. The trail was narrow and winding, sneaking through dense clusters of pine and spruce. Birds chirped overhead, and occasionally I heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, probably just squirrels. I thought about an hour into my hike, I came across a clearing with an old weathered picnic table. It seemed out of place, like it hadn't been used in years. Carved into the wood were various names and messages. One read, "Time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time." I chuckled. Well, if that's the case, I'm being extremely productive right now. I sat down to take a sip of water when I noticed a figure emerging from the trees on the other side of the clearing. He was a tall man, maybe in his late 40s, with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it had never met a comb. He wore a tattered flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. Over his shoulder he carried a large duffel bag. Afternoon, I called out, trying to sound friendly. He looked at me with a blank expression before a slow smile spread across his face. "Enjoying the solitude?" he asked. "Absolutely," I replied. "Hard to beat this kind of peace and quiet." He walked over and placed his duffel bag on the table. The bag made a heavy thud. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked. "Not at all," I said, though something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't quite match his smile. "Name's Elias," he said, extending a hand. "Nolan," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm. "So, what brings you out here, Nolan?" he inquired. "Just needed a break from the daily grind. Thought I'd reconnect with nature a bit," I answered. He nodded slowly. "Nature has a way of showing us who we really are." "That's the idea," I said, forcing a smile. There was an awkward silence. To break it, I pointed at the carvings on the table. "Some interesting philosophies people have left here." He glanced at the table and smirked. "Words left behind by those who passed through. Everyone leaves a mark, whether they realize it or not." "True enough," I said, "kind of like that saying, leave nothing but footprints, take nothing but memories." He chuckled softly. "Or sometimes you take something more." I wasn't sure what to make of that comment. Before I could respond, he unzipped his duffel bag. Inside, I caught a glimpse of various tools, some rusty knives, a handsaw, and what looked like old camping gear. "Planning a project?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Something like that," he replied, his tone cryptic and uneasy. Feeling settled in my stomach. "Well, I should probably get moving before it gets dark," I said. Standing up, he looked at me intently. "The woods can be dangerous after dark. Lots of wild animals out there." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. "Safe travels, Nolan," he said, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Thanks, you too," I replied before heading back toward the trail. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on me. I resisted the urge to look back. You're just being paranoid. I told myself not everyone you meet in the woods is a serial killer. The return hike seemed longer. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplified in the quiet forest. At one point I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around there was nothing but trees. Get a grip, man, I muttered. I reached the campground just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The RVs that had been there earlier were gone. I was alone. Great, I sighed. Front row seats to the night sky. I entered the RV and locked the door, feeling a bit foolish for my earlier jitters. I cooked up some dinner, canned chili, the bachelor's specialty, and settled in with a book. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches of the nearby trees. The RV swayed gently, almost lulling me to sleep. Around 10 p.m., just as I was contemplating calling it a night, I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like footsteps circling the RV. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all was silent, except for the wind, then a soft tapping on the window. Probably a branch, I whispered, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The tapping came again, more deliberate this time. I stood up slowly and moved toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Peering through the curtain, I saw nothing but darkness. Is someone there? I called out instantly. Regretting its silence, I decided to turn on the exterior lights. Flicking the switch, the floodlights illuminated the area around the RV. Still, there was nothing to be seen. You're losing it, Nolan, I said to myself. Next, you'll be telling ghost stories. I shut off the lights and headed to the bedroom area, determined to get some sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind and trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Just as I was drifting off, a loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up, my senses on high alert. The thud came again, this time accompanied by a scraping sound along the side of the RV. Enough was enough. I grabbed a flashlight and the small utility knife I kept in the drawer. Better than nothing. Stealing myself, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit me and I could see my breath forming small clouds. Who's there? I demanded, shining the flashlight around. At first there was nothing, then I noticed something on the ground near the back of the RV. A dead rabbit, its body mangled. What in the world? I whispered. Nice night for a stroll, a voice said. From the darkness I spun around, shining the light toward the sound. Standing just beyond the reach of the beam was Elias. Elias, what are you doing here? I asked, my voice shaking. Thought I'd pay you a visit, he said, stepping forward. In his hand he held the same rusty knife I'd seen in his duffel bag. This isn't funny, I said, trying to sound authoritative. You need to leave. He tilted his head, but we were just getting acquainted. I backed toward the RV door. I'm calling the authorities, he laughed. Out here it'll take them at least an hour to get here. Plenty of time for us to catch up. My mind raced. I needed to get inside and lock the door. I took another step back, never taking my eyes off him. Why the rush? He asked, his smile widening. We have all the time in the world. Without another word I bolted for the door. I could hear him running after me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Just as he reached it, he pounded on the door. Let me in, Nolan. It's rude to leave a guest outside. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My hands fumbled for my phone. No signal. Come on, Nolan, he taunted. I just want to talk. I looked around desperately. The keys, they were still in the ignition. If I could start the RV, maybe I could get out of here. I scrambled to the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Not now, I groaned, trying again. The engine roared to life. Elias was now at the windshield, his face pressed against the glass. "You can't run from this," he snarled. I put the RV in gear and floored it. The massive vehicle lurched forward, knocking him aside. In the side mirror I saw him scramble to his feet and chase after me, but I was gaining distance. The road was dark and winding. I drove as fast as I dared, the RV groaning with each turn. My heart was racing, but relief was starting to set. And then up ahead I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked across the road was an old pickup truck, blocking the way. I hit the brakes, skidding to a halt just meters from the truck. I recognized it. It was the same truck that had been at the campground earlier. Trapped, I whispered. I heard the sound of an engine behind me. Glancing in the mirror, I saw another vehicle's headlights approaching. Thinking quickly, I turned the RV onto a narrow dirt path off the main road. Trees scraped against the sides as I maneuvered through the dense forest. The path grew narrower and I knew I couldn't go much further. I spotted a small clearing and pulled in, killing the engine and the lights. Silence. I waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed, no signs of pursuit. Maybe I lost him, I thought. Suddenly a beam of light swept across the trees. He was out there searching. I crouched low, peering through a gap in the curtains. Elias moved methodically, his flashlight scanning the area. He was patient, like a predator stalking prey. I needed a plan. Staying in the RV was a sitting duck situation. I remembered there was a ranger station a few miles back. If I could make it there, I might find help. Quietly I gathered my backpack and slipped out the side door, keeping low. The forest was dense, providing ample cover. I moved as silently as possible, putting distance between myself and the RV behind me. I heard Elias shouting, "You can't hide forever, Nolan." I pushed onward. The terrain rough and uneven. Branches scratched my face and arms, but I didn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights through the trees. The ranger station. I broke into a run, bursting out of the woods and onto the gravel path leading to the building. I pounded on the door. "Help, please open up." The door opened and a middle-aged man in a ranger uniform appeared. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes wide. "There's a man. He's trying to kill me," I gasped. He ushered me inside and locked the door. "Calm down, tell me what happened." As I began to explain, the windows shattered. Elias had found a "Stay here," the ranger ordered. Pulling out his service weapon, Elias burst through the door, tackling the ranger to the ground. They struggled, the gun sliding across the floor toward me. "Grab it," the ranger yelled. I lunged for the weapon, my hands shaking. Turning, I saw Elias overpower the ranger, slamming his head against the floor. "Hey," I shouted, aiming the gun. Elias looked up, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "Do you have it in you, Nolan? Don't test me," I warned. He took a step toward me. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the small space, and Elias staggered back, clutching his shoulder. He laughed, a chilling sound. "It's not that easy," he taunted. He charged at me. I fired again, this time hitting him square in the chest. He collapsed to the ground, motionless. I stood there, the gun still aimed at his lifeless body. The ranger groaned, stirring slightly. "Are you okay?" I asked, rushing to his side. "I'll live," he mumbled. "You did good." Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have heard the commotion and called for help. Paramedics and additional law enforcement arrived shortly after. They tended to the ranger and confirmed that Elias was dead. As they secured the scene, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and disbelief. It was over. A detective approached me later as I sat outside the station wrapped in a blanket. We ran his prints. He said his name was Elias Mercer. He's been off the grid for years. Who was he? I asked. A former surgeon who lost his license due to malpractice. After that he disappeared. We've linked him to multiple disappearees in the area over the past decade. I swallowed hard. Why was he doing this? The detective sighed. Hard to say for sure. Some people just have a darkness in them. I nodded, staring off into the forest. A place that had seemed so inviting now felt tainted. You're lucky to be alive, he added. Yeah, I replied. I suppose I am. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, I knew one thing for certain: accounting might be boring, but at least the only thing trying to kill me there was the coffee. I was about halfway through my road trip, somewhere between the dense forests of northern Pennsylvania, when my car decided to give up on me. It was typical of my luck, really. I had spent the last few years bouncing between jobs, trying to find some semblance of stability. The road trip was supposed to be my break from the monotonous grind, a chance to clear my head. I pulled over to the side of the road and popped the hood, hoping it was something simple. It wasn't. Steam billowed out and the engine hissed angrily, mocking my mechanical ignorance. I grabbed my phone only to find there was no signal. Great. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the sun was starting its slow descent, casting long shadows across the desolate road. As I stood there contemplating my next move, I heard the faint rumble of an engine approaching. A beat-up pickup truck emerged from around the bend, its driver slowing down when he saw my predicament. The truck came to a stop, and a man in his 40s with a rough beard and weathered skin stepped out. Car trouble? He asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Yeah, I replied. It just overheated, I think. No cell service either, he nodded, peering under the hood. I can take a look if you want. Name's Clyde, by the way. Thanks, I'm Grant, I said. Stepping inside, Clyde fiddled with the engine for a few minutes before straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. You're going to need a tow. Closest town with a garage is about 20 miles up. I can give you a lift if you want. With little choice, I agreed. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, locked up the car, and climbed into Clyde's truck. As we drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. Conversation with Clyde was sparse, punctuated by the occasional comment about the weather or the condition of the road. We reached a small town just as dusk was turning into night. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Dusty streets, old wooden buildings, and a general store that doubled as a diner. Clyde dropped me off at the diner, promising to call the local mechanic to tow my car in the morning. I stepped into the diner, greeted by the smell of frying bacon and the sound of an old jukebox playing a country tune. A woman in her 50s with a kind face and a name tag that read March welcomed me and took my order. The few patrons inside glanced at me curiously but returned to their meals without a word. As I ate, March came over with a pot of coffee. You passing through? She asked. Her tone friendly, yet car broke down a few miles back. Clyde gave me a ride into town. Marge nodded. Clyde's a good man, grew up around here. You need a place to stay. We got a motel just down the road. Yeah, that would be great, thanks. After finishing my meal, I followed Marge's directions to the motel. It was a small single-story building with a flickering neon sign that read motel. I checked in with the elderly man at the front desk, who handed me a key with a weary smile. The room was basic but clean. I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from the day's events. As I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since I arrived in town. Maybe it was the isolation or the fact that my car had broken down in the middle of nowhere. Either way, I hoped things would look better in the morning. The next morning, I walked back to the diner for breakfast. Clyde was already there, chatting with Marge and a few of the regular dealer. He waved me over when he saw me. Morning, Grand Mechanics on his way to tow your car. Should be here soon. Thanks, Clyde. I appreciate it. As I sat down, a young woman entered the diner. She looked out of place with her stylish clothes and expensive-looking handbag. She approached our table, a worried expression on her face. Excuse me, have any of you seen my brother? He was supposed to meet me here last night, but he never showed up. Marge frowned. What's his name? Dear Logan. Logan Bennett. He drives a silver SUV. Clyde and the others exchanged glances. Haven't seen anyone like that, Clyde said. You sure he was coming through here? The woman nodded. Yes, he called me from a gas station a few miles back, said he'd be here in an hour. A chill ran down my spine. If Logan had disappeared, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that something could happen to me too. I needed to get my car fixed and get out of here. The mechanic arrived shortly after breakfast, towing my car to his garage. He was a burly man named Hank with grease-stained overalls and a non-nonsense demeanor. He confirmed that my car's radiator was shot and it would take a day to get the part and fix it. With nothing else to do, I wandered around town trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. I noticed a few more missing person flyers posted on bulletin boards and telephone poles, faces of people who had passed through and never made it out. As evening approached, I returned to the diner for dinner. The young woman, whose name I learned was Chelsea, was still there talking to the sheriff. Sheriff Tomlin was an imposing figure with a stern face and a badge that looked like it had seen better days. He assured Chelsea that he'd look into her brother's appearance, but I could tell he didn't have much hope. After dinner, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The town was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I found myself drawn to the edge of the forest, where a narrow path led into the darkness. Against my better judgment, I followed the path. The trees closed in around me and the air grew colder. I walked for what felt like an hour, my flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard something, a faint cry for help. I froze, listening intently. The cry came again, more urgent this time. I pushed through the underbrush, my heart pounding. The trees parted, revealing a small clearing. In the center, I saw a figure tied to a tree, struggling against the ropes. Logan, I called out, stepping closer. The figure looked up and I recognized Logan's face from the flyer. He was bruised and bloody, but alive. Help me, he croaked, his voice weak. I rushed to his side, fumbling with the knots. Who did This to you, Clyde, Logan whispered. He's not who you think he is. My blood ran cold. I had trusted Clyde, relied on him. If he was behind this, I had to get Logan out of here before it was too late. I finally freed him, and we stumbled back towards the path. As we neared the edge of the forest, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Clyde emerged from the shadows, a hunting knife in his hand. Where do you think you're going? He snarled. Stay back, Clyde, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We're leaving. Clyde laughed, a harsh guttural sound. You think you can just walk away? I don't think so. Logan and I backed away, but Clyde lunged forward, slashing at us with the knife. We dodged, and I grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it at him with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and Clyde stumbled back. Dazed. Run, I shouted to Logan. We sprinted towards the town, not daring to look back. The lights of the motel came into view, and we burst through the door, panting and disheveled. The elderly man at the front desk looked up, alarmed. Call the sheriff, I gasped. Clyde tried to kill us. The sheriff arrived minutes later, along with Marge and a few other townsfolk. Clyde was nowhere to be found, but the evidence of his crimes was undeniable. Logan's story, combined with the missing person reports, painted a grim picture as the sheriff and his deputies combed the forest for Clyde. I sat in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee. Chelsea thanked me profusely for finding her brother, tears of relief streaming down her face when the sheriff returned. He had a grim expression. We didn't find Clyde, but we found evidence that he's been doing this for years. Bones, belongings. It's worse than we thought. I nodded, too exhausted to feel anything but relief that it was over. The sheriff promised to keep searching, but I had a feeling Clyde was long gone. The next day, with my car finally fixed, I prepared to leave town. Marge packed me a lunch for the road, and Hank waved me off with a promise to call if he heard anything. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Clyde was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. But that was a problem for another day. For now, I was just grateful to be alive. Driving down the highway, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Clyde's truck following me, but the road was empty, and I focused on my horizon ahead, determined to put the nightmare behind. I'm Aller Thorne, and in 2019 I took my RV up to the remote stretches near White Horse, Yukon Territory. I figured a bit of solitude might do me good, even if my idea of roughing it is forgetting the Wi-Fi password. The open road had a certain allure, and I was ready to trade city noise for the whispers of the wilderness. The drive was long but therapeutic, miles of towering pines and sprawling landscapes unfolded before me. Every so often I'd pass a lone gas station or a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s. At one such diner I stopped for a bite. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Marge, served me a slice of pie that was as thick as a book. Not many folks head this way alone, she remarked, pouring me a fresh cup of coffee. One, not many folks, I chuckled, just needed a break from the hustle and bustle. She gave me a curious look. Be careful out there, the wilderness has a way of showing you things you might not be ready to see. Sounds like the tagline to a horror movie, I joked. She didn't laugh. Instead, she just refilled my coffee and walked away. Chalk it up to small town quirks, I thought. Back on the road, I couldn't shake her words, but the scenery soon took over my thoughts. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the treetops. I found a clearing off a dirt road, a perfect spot to park the RV for the night. I set up camp, lit a small fire, and pulled out my guitar. Not that I'm any good, but there's something about strumming chords in the wilderness that makes you feel like a rock star. As darkness enveloped the forest, the sounds of nature grew louder, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, a symphony of solitude. I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and contemplating life's big questions, like why mosquitoes exist and why I didn't pack more bug spray. Suddenly a rustling noise came from behind the RV, probably a deer, I told myself. Still, I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam caught a fleeting shadow disappearing into the tree line. "Hello," I called out. "If that's you, Bigfoot, I'm not in the mood for hide and seek." Silence. I shrugged it off and went back to the fire, but the unsettling feeling lingered. To calm my nerves, I decided to call it a night. I secured the RV, double-checking the lock, something I rarely did. Climbing into bed, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the RV seemed amplified. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling outside. They were deliberate, heavy, not the scampering of an animal, but the measured pace of someone or something that knew exactly where it was going. I sat up, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response, just the continued crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. I reached for my phone, but realized it was on the kitchen counter, charging. Classic me, always leaving things where they don't belong. Mustering some courage, I crept toward the front of the RV to peek out the window. The darkness was thick, but under the pale moonlight I saw a figure standing about 20 feet away, tall, wearing what looked like a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was obscured by shadows. "Hey, this is private property," I lied. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, eerily still. A chill ran down my spine. I considered my options: stay inside and hope he'd go away, or confront the stranger. Neither seemed appealing. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. Instinct kicked and I locked the driver's side door and scrambled to the back to lock the rear entrance. Just as I secured it, I heard the unmistakable sound of a hand trying the handle. "Listen, buddy, I'm calling the cops," I yelled, hoping to deter him. Silence again. Then a low, growly voice whispered through the thin walls of the RV phones. "Don't work out here." Panic surged. How did he know I didn't have my phone? Was he watching me earlier? I needed a weapon. Rummaging through the kitchenette, I found a hefty cast iron skillet. Not exactly a sword, but it would have to do. The windows were too small to climb out of, and both doors were now compromised. The RV rocked slightly as he began pounding on the side. Each thud echoed, matching the frantic beating of my heart. "Leave me alone," I shouted, gripping the skillet so tight my knuckles whitened. He stopped pounding. "You're all alone out here," he said slowly. "No one to hear you." I had to think fast. An idea flickered. The keys were still in the ignition. If I could start the engine, maybe I could jolt him enough to make a run for it. I inched toward the front, careful not to make noise. P.I.N.G. out. I didn't see him anymore. Taking a deep breath, I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Come on, don't do this to me now," I begged, turning the key again. This time the engine roared to life. Relief was short-lived. The driver's side window shattered as a heavy object crashed Through it shards of glass flew, one cutting my cheek. I yelped in pain, but through the RV and to drive the vehicle lurched forward, tires spitting dirt through the broken window. I saw him in the side mirror, standing there, a sledgehammer in hand. His face was still hidden, but I caught a glimpse of a sinister grin speeding down the dirt road. Branches scraped the sides of the RV like fingernails on a chalkboard. My hands trembled on the wheel. I needed to find help. Up ahead, the road forked left would take me deeper into the wilderness. Right, LED back toward the main highway. I feared right, but as I did, the RV jolted violently. The front tire had blown out, probably from the rough terrain. Fantastic, I muttered. Just my luck. I had to keep moving, grabbing my phone from the counter. I noticed there was still no signal. Of course, I decided to proceed on foot. Outside, the night was cold and the forest seemed to close in around me. Every rustle made me jump. I headed down the road, hoping to find a ranger station or maybe another camper. After about 20 minutes of walking, I saw a faint light between the trees, a cabin. Salvation. Perhaps as I approached, the structure became clearer. It was a small, weathered cabin with a single light hanging from the porch. I knocked on the door, trying to steady my voice. Hello, is anyone home? The door creaked open. An older man with a rugged beard and tired eyes looked me over. Can I help you? He asked cautiously. Someone attacked me. My RV is a ways back, and I need to call the police. He nodded slowly. Coming inside, the cabin was sparse but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. He handed me a towel to wipe the blood from my cheek. Name's Elias, he said. You're lucky you found this place. Not many people come out this far. Yeah, lucky me, I replied, the irony thick in my voice. He offered me a seat and picked up an old rotary phone. Lines are down, he sighed after a moment. Storm last week messed them up. Of course they are. You say someone attacked you? Yes, some guy in a hat and coat. He smashed my window and tried to get into my RV. Elias's face grew stern. Did he follow you? I don't think so. My tire blew out and I walked here. He stood up abruptly. We need to leave now. Why? That wasn't just some guy. Sounds like you're talking about Mercer. Who's Mercer? Elias grabbed a shotgun from above the fireplace. No time to explain. We have to get to town. Panic flared again. You're scaring me, man. He looked me dead in the eyes. You should be scared. We stepped outside, and that's when I saw it, the silhouette of the man from earlier standing between the trees about 50 yards away. Get behind me, Elias ordered. Mercer stepped forward, the moonlight illuminating his face for the first time. His skin was weathered, scars crisscrossing his cheeks. Cold dark eyes locked onto us. Elias, he called out mockingly, got yourself a new friend. Stay back, Mercer, Eli shouted, cocking the shotgun. Mercer laughed, a hollow sound that sent a shiver through me. You think that pea shooter scares me? Without warning, Mercer lunged forward with alarming speed. Elias fired the blast, echoing through the forest. Mercer staggered but kept coming. Run, Elias yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted back toward the road, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Behind me I heard scuffling, another gunshot, then a pained cry. I glanced back to see Elias on the ground, Mercer standing over him, blood-stained. Mercer's coat. He looked up at me, a sinister smile stretching across his face. You're next, he sneered. Adrenaline surged and I pushed myself harder. The trees blurred as branches slapped against my face and arms. I could hear Footsteps behind me gaining ground. Up ahead I saw headlights. A truck was coming down the road. I burst from the tree line, waving my arms frantically. "Stop, please," the truck screeched to a halt. A middle-aged woman rolled down the window. "What's going on?" "There's a man. He's trying to kill me." Her eyes widened. Kit and I scrambled into the passenger seat. As we sped off, I looked back. Mercer stood in the middle of the road watching us leave. He didn't chase us, he just stood there, his figure shrinking into the distance. "Thank you," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "Name's Linda," she said, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You're lucky I was passing through. Seems to be a theme tonight," I replied. She glanced at me. "Was that Mercer? You know him. Everyone around here knows about Mercer Thompson. He's been a menace for years. They say he's former military, went off the grid after some incidents." She nodded grimly. "People disappearing, bodies found, mutilated. Authorities could never pin anything on him. Why hasn't he been arrested?" She sighed. "Out here the laws stretch thin and folks tend to handle things on their own." We drove into town, a small cluster of buildings that seemed almost abandoned. Linda pulled up to a building with a faded sign that read Sheriff's Office. Inside, a tired-looking deputy sat behind a desk. "Evening, Linda. Who's this here?" As she looked at me, "Ellery Thorne," I supplied. "Aller had a run-in with Mercer." The deputy's expression darkened. "Tell me everything." I recounted the night's events, the attack on my RV, Elias's cabin, the chase through the woods. The deputy rubbed his temples. "Elias is a good man. We'll send a team out there. Shouldn't we go now?" I pressed. He shook his head. "It's not safe at night. We'll head out at first light." Frustration boiled over. First light? He could be dead by then. "Listen, son, we've been dealing with Mercer for a long time. Charging into the woods at night is a fool's errand." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're just going to do nothing?" Linda placed a hand on my shoulder. "Best to get some rest. There's a motel across the street." Defeated, I agreed. At the motel, the clerk handed me a key. Without a word, the room was modest. Just a bed and a bathroom. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Sleep was impossible. I paced the room, replaying everything in my mind. Who was Mercer Thompson, and why did it feel like the whole town was complicit in keeping his secrets? Around 3 a.m. a soft tapping sounded at the window. I froze. The tapping grew more insistent. A voice whispered. It was Linda. I approached the window cautiously. "What are you doing?" She glanced over her shoulder. "I shouldn't be here, but you deserve to know the truth." I opened the window a crack. "What truth?" "Mercer's not acting alone." The deputy, "The townsfolk, they're all part of it." "Part of what?" "There's a cult, for lack of a better word. They believe in some twisted form of justice targeting outsiders." A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I was once a part of it. I got out, but I can't stand by and watch another innocent person get hurt." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Outside my room. "They're coming," she hissed. "You need to leave now." I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the window. Linda led me through back alleys, staying in the shadows. "There's a car at the edge of town," she whispered. "Keys are in it. Take it and go." "Come with me," I urged. She shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." We reached the car, a rusty old sedan. I jumped in and started the engine. "Thank you," I said, looking up at her. She gave a sad smile. "Get as far away from here as you can." I didn't need more encouragement. I sped off the town disappearing in the rearview mirror as dawn broke. I crossed back into more populated areas. I found a state police station and reported everything in. Investigation was launched. They found Elias's cabin burned to the ground, but no sign of him or Mercer. The town claimed ignorance, chalking my story up to hysteria. Months later, I did some digging. Mercer Thompson had been dishonorably discharged from the military for extreme misconduct. Reports linked him to multiple disappearances, but nothing ever stuck. As for the town, it remained shrouded in secrecy. Linda couldn't be reached. It was as if she vanished. I moved on with my life, but the events of that night never left me. I often wondered about Elias, about Linda, and about the dark underbelly of that secluded town. One day an unmarked envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a photograph of Mercer, ice cold, a twisted smile on his face. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Still watching." I reported it to the authorities, but there were no leads. I realized then that some shadows can't be escaped. They linger, a constant reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, but I wasn't about to let fear control me. I took precautions, stayed alert, and continued forward. As for Mercer Thompson, his true motivations remained a mystery. Perhaps he was just a psychopath drawn to the isolation of the wilderness, or maybe he was the tip of a much larger iceberg. Either way, I wasn't his victim. Not then, not.